Hello everyone, I know you watched this video to accompany you to sleep. So if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, don't forget to tell me where you are from and what time you watched this video. Let's jump straight into the story. Story 1. A deadly love triangle. When a person falls in love, they often become weaker, more vulnerable, and prone to idealizing the object of their affection. In such a state, it's difficult to critically assess the qualities of the beloved. Any negativity from their side is quickly justified, and clear problems or odd behaviors are simply ignored. Overwhelmed by feelings, we tend to overlook the shortcomings of our beloved. But if those feelings are not mutual and the loved one is capable of deceit or criminal acts, the lover can find themselves in serious danger. Several years ago, the story of a young man named Diogo Goncalves shook all of Portugal due to its cruelty and cold-bloodedness, with two young, fragile-looking girls with angelic appearances as the ruthless perpetrators. The deceased youth and his executioners were participants in a love triangle, but do not be too quick to blame Diogo. He was not romantically involved with the two girls, but became the victim of the schemes and greed of his charming colleague, whom he loved unrequitedly, and her lover. Now let's carefully examine this complex case from the beginning to understand how quiet and modest beauties turned into cruel criminals, robbers, and carjackers. Why the victim's body was found in pieces in various places, and how a serious and prudent young man failed to realize he was lured into a deadly trap. The story of Diogo Goncalves. Diogo Goncalves was born on July 17, 1999, in the picturesque resort town of Albufeira, located in the south of Portugal. He was the only child of a simple and relatively modest family. His parents ran a small souvenir shop, so their well-being depended directly on the season and the number of tourists visiting the town. Diogo grew up modest, polite, and friendly. He did well in school, was interested in computers from a young age, and dreamed of a career in programming. People spoke of him as an open, sociable young man with many friends, both in and outside of school. He disliked being alone, hence he always sought the company of family or friends. After finishing school, the young man enrolled in a computer academy, but since the education was quite expensive, he also took a part-time job at a fast food restaurant to help his parents and partially pay for his education. Diogo had already established himself as a hard-working and very reliable employee who could be counted on in every way. In early 2017, tragedy struck the Goncalves family. The family head suffered a severe stroke which left him balancing on the brink of life and death for several weeks. When his condition stabilized, the man remained incapacitated for a long time and was under constant medical supervision. But misfortune does not come alone, and while the father fought for his life, his wife was struck by a car on her way to the hospital. The incident happened suddenly at a pedestrian crossing. As the woman reached the middle of the road, a car appeared out of nowhere at high speed, literally throwing her into the air, and without even braking, sped away. The impact was so forceful that the victim was thrown a dozen meters, sustained an open head injury, and had no chance of survival. Medics arrived within minutes, but they could only declare her death. The driver responsible for the fatal accident was detained the next day, but despite the clear evidence of his guilt, a long and complicated legal battle ensued as the man had hired a competent lawyer. The unfortunate Diogo, not yet 18, was left completely alone. At that moment, his aunt, the sister of his father, arrived in Albufeira and offered to become the guardian of the teenager and to care for her bedridden brother. However, the relationship between the aunt and her nephew was far from perfect. The authoritative woman dictated her rules, which the young man greatly disliked, and as soon as he reached adulthood, he immediately moved to a rented apartment. Unrequited love, a young software specialist, was interning at one of the largest tourist spas in the region. His skills and abilities were highly regarded by the management, and he was offered a permanent position with a stable income. Additionally, the sociable, open, and friendly young man quickly integrated into the team and formed friendships with his colleagues. Diogo conscientiously performed his duties and was always ready to help others. At this spa center worked an attractive young woman named Maria Malvero, towards whom the new IT specialist developed tender feelings. He began to court her cautiously, but for the most part, the colleague ignored his advances. Nevertheless, she communicated with him willingly, accepted gifts, but responded to all date invitations with refusals or quickly changed the subject. Who held a rather untraditional position as a security service employee. Maria combined strength and femininity. She was approachable yet unattainable, and the young man couldn't resist her. This was his first true love, which proved to be fateful for him. Maria, the complicated Maria Malvero, a year older than Diogo, was also a native of Albufeira and came from a very modest family. She never knew her biological father, as he left when she was very young and subsequently showed no interest in her fate or provided financial support. Maria was raised by her mother and grandmother, but her grandmother passed away a few years ago, and her mother was diagnosed with a severe mental disorder and placed in a specialized clinic. From a young age, Maria understood that she could only rely on herself, and thus she strived to make her way in life. She was seriously involved in sports from school, strong and physically developed, while maintaining a delicate and graceful appearance. In high school, she took up jiu-jitsu and even earned a blue belt. Malvero dreamed of a career in law enforcement, but due to her mother's mental condition, she was denied admission to the police academy, which greatly upset her, and was accepted into the security department of the spa center. Maria's salary barely covered the essentials, as she had to pay for the treatment and care of her ailing mother, whose condition was deteriorating. Nonetheless, the young woman did not despair. She remained optimistic about the future and was kind and friendly with those around her. However, the infatuated Diogo misinterpreted her politeness as reciprocal interest. He even turned down a promising job offer in the capital because he hoped to win Maria's love and did not want to be away from her. The young man spent a third of his salary on his beloved, buying her gifts and taking her to restaurants and amusement parks. They soon appeared to be a happy couple, yet throughout their time together, Maria never once allowed him a kiss. However, as it turned out, her reserve was not due to excessive modesty or shyness. One day, Diogo stumbled upon a short video on social media where his beloved was hugging and kissing another girl. It turned out she had been in a romantic relationship with 23-year-old Mariana Finesco for over a year. Devastated, Diogo confronted Maria, asking why she had not been upfront with him, but she replied that she preferred to keep her personal life private. Despite such a revelation, Goncalves continued his courtship, never giving up hope that one day she might reciprocate his love. The greed for easy gain Mariana Finesco also came from a humble background and received no financial support from her family. She graduated from a nursing college and worked as a basic nurse at a local hospital. She and Maria dreamed of renting a place together to live, but their modest incomes and the need to support their families made this impossible. He mentioned that the court case against the driver who fatally struck his mother had just concluded. The driver was found guilty and ordered to pay a substantial compensation of 100,000 euros, which had been transferred to Diogo's account that very day. Diogo spoke about it dispassionately, even with sadness, as no amount of money could bring back his closest person, and he didn't notice Maria's eyes light up when she heard the news. From that moment, their relationship unexpectedly progressed to a new level for Diogo. Maria began showing interest in him, and even tenderly held his hand during walks, something she had never done before. Goncalves couldn't believe his luck, feeling as though his deepest dream was coming true, but he did not ponder why this was happening or what caused such sudden and drastic changes in Maria's behavior. He simply enjoyed the moments, believing Maria's feelings for him were genuine. In reality, as soon as Malvero learned about the money Diogo had received, she shared the news with Finesco, and together they started planning how to seize these funds. Initially, they needed to make Diogo believe that Maria had finally noticed him as a man and reciprocated his affection. Then, the women planned to use either deceit or force to take the money from the young man and escape to another country, where they could start a new life with the stolen funds. A romantic evening turns into a brutal encounter. One day, Maria approached Diogo unexpectedly and suggested spending a romantic evening together. She mentioned that perhaps their relationship could reach a new level, that they could become a couple, and that something might develop between them. At that moment, Diogo was truly happy, and the sudden changes in the girl's behavior did not alarm him. He believed in the sincerity of her feelings. The long-awaited meeting was set for the evening of Friday, March 20th, 2020, at Diogo's rented apartment. The young man himself prepared dinner, set a table for two, bought flowers and a small gift for his beloved. Maria arrived around 8 o'clock in the evening. They sat down at the table, and she poured a fruit fresh that she had brought, urging Diogo to drink all of its contents to appreciate the taste of the beverage she had prepared. Without hesitation, he did so, unaware that the juice contained a high dose of a potent sedative that Mariana had obtained from her workplace. Soon Diogo felt unwell. His head was spinning. Everything before his eyes blurred, and he felt sleepy. He realized something was wrong, and became very nervous trying to reach his phone. But Maria snatched the device from his hands, saying she wanted to perform an erotic dance for him. He began to slowly undress, and the young man seemed to calm down a bit. Then she tied him to a chair, presenting it as part of the game. At some point, Diogo panicked, tried to free himself, but fell to the floor along with the chair. Seeing Maria simply watching the events unfold, he began to scream and call for help, hoping that the neighbors could hear him. Then she pressed on his neck, after which the young man lost consciousness. After this, she called Mariana, who had been waiting in a car parked nearby, ready for a signal. When Finesco entered the apartment, she saw Diogo lying on the floor and asked what had happened. Maria explained that the dosage of the drug had apparently been too small, and Diogo had not fallen asleep, but started to panic and scream. The girls noticed that he was not breathing and decided to untie him, and Mariana, using her skills, began CPR. When Diogo regained consciousness, he again began to scream, tried to resist, and ran out of the apartment, but Maria, using her martial arts skills, knocked him down and performed a chokehold. A few minutes later, Gonzalez showed no signs of life, and the friends did not attempt to revive him further. The imperfect crime using fingerprints and Face ID, the girls managed to unlock the deceased young man's phone and access his banking app. They transferred all his available funds to Maria's account, and then pondered how to dispose of the body to delay its discovery as long as possible. Knowing that Goncalves was expected at work the next day, Malvero decided to send a message from his phone to his boss, requesting time off due to sudden family issues. As during his tenure, the programmer had never asked for time off, been late, or swapped shifts. The boss tried to call the employee to find out what was happening, but all calls were rejected, followed by a message from Diogo claiming he couldn't talk right now. On Saturday, still contemplating what to do with the body, the culprits went to a large shopping mall where they spent some of the money they had stolen from the victim. Surveillance camera footage showed them behaving casually, making purchases, eating at the food court, and smiling as they chatted. They did not appear tense and clearly believed they could evade accountability. Returning to the apartment, the friends decided to sever Diogo's thumb so they could unlock his phone if needed to send messages on his behalf. It was at that moment they realized the best course would be to dismember the body and scatter it in various places, staging the young man's disappearance as if he had taken his own life. They bought plastic wrap and large trash bags and, using a kitchen cleaver and knives, separated the limbs and head from the torso. Mariana's knowledge of human anatomy proved quite useful during this gruesome task. The friends then packed all the parts into 4 bags, which they carried out of the apartment late at night and loaded into the trunk of Diogo's car. Maria drove the car of her deceased admirer, followed by her accomplice in her own vehicle. They drove out of town to a cliff where they dropped the bag containing the torso off the edge, leaving the car near the cliff to make it look as though the young man had jumped. However, they failed to notice that the body did not sink, but got stuck in a crevice at the base of the cliff. They then drove a few miles to a wooded slope where they threw out the head, and discarded the victim's limbs over a small waterfall. Body parts on the coast that Saturday, the management of the spa center reported the employee's disappearance to the police, mentioning the strange messages sent from his number. However, the search for the young man did not start until Sunday, a full day after the disappearance was reported. The first discovery was his car at the cliff's edge, and initially, it was presumed he had taken his own life. But just a few hours later, authorities found a torso in a bag in the crevice below, which was soon confirmed to be Goncalves through forensic analysis. The same day, a group of tourists reported to the police that they had found a torn bag containing a human head. The limbs were only found several days later after extensive searches involving divers. The crime scene was horrific, but according to colleagues and friends of the deceased, he had no enemies, was kind-hearted, never broke the law, and did not associate with people who had criminal records or were linked to criminal activities. But who then could have brutally taken the life of such a quiet and friendly young man? The investigation, arrest, and initial court decision. From the early stages of the investigation, it was discovered that the young man had recently received a significant amount of money in his account as compensation from a court decision. However, it was found that mysteriously, this money had been transferred to Diogo's colleague Maria. She was interrogated as she and Mariana were about to leave the country through the airport. Malvero was caught off guard. She did not expect the police to track them down within just a few days. She confessed immediately, claiming that she committed the crime because her colleague had pursued her and tried to coerce her into intimacy. She also asserted that she had planned and executed the crime on her own, insisting her partner had no involvement. Nonetheless, both women were detained and taken to the station to give their statements. Maria insisted that she had accidentally strangled the young man after he tried to force her into intimacy. However, Diogo's colleagues maintained that he would never treat a woman he liked in such a manner, a sentiment supported by the correspondence between the victim and the accused. Additionally, a high concentration of a potent sedative found in the victim's blood suggested that he was incapacitated at the time of his death. Maria then tried to take full responsibility again, claiming she had committed the crime for the money. She alleged that Mariana was unaware, and when the incident occurred, she even tried to perform CPR on the young man. Mariana, however, contended that they had planned the theft together, intending only to transfer the money to their account and then flee, but that things did not go as planned. There was no doubt about the guilt of the women, but determining their exact roles in the crime proved challenging. Both pleaded to be placed in the same jail during the investigation so they could at least see each other, but despite their requests, they were placed in separate detention facilities, denying them any communication or contact. The trial began in July 2020. Despite Malvero's persistent claims of sole responsibility, investigators doubted she questioning how she could skillfully dismember a body without anatomical knowledge. A 6-month period was allotted for the investigation to gather all relevant circumstances, evidence, and testimony. Throughout this time, the suspects had no contact with each other, and the case took an unexpected turn. At a hearing in February 2021, when Maria again claimed full responsibility, Mariana simply confirmed her statements, declaring she had no involvement in the murder or robbery. Maria's lover's behavior seemingly dismayed her, and a month later, Malvero changed her initial testimony. She now claimed that she acted under Mariana's direction, who was the crime's mastermind, and noted that it was her friend who dismembered the body because she knew how to do it best, but realized that her friend had never truly loved her. Despite Malvero's altered testimony in April 2021, the court found her guilty of premeditated murder, mutilation of a body, robbery, and carjacking. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Mariana, as an accomplice, received a 4-year sentence, but was released on parole in less than a year. The court believed her attempts to perform CPR indicated that she had not intended to take his life and wanted to help. A new trial and an unexpected twist. After being released, Mariana Finesco agreed to give an interview to a local TV channel, a decision that proved to be a grave mistake. During the interview, she placed all the blame on her already incarcerated friend, all the while smiling and appearing very self-satisfied. A well-known psychologist analyzed it, explaining how gestures, facial expressions, and body language can indicate deception. He suggested that Mariana was reveling in her impunity and sense of superiority, indicating she was a seed manipulator capable of shifting all blame onto someone else. A month after her release, Finesco sued the hospital where she had previously worked, claiming she had been wrongfully terminated, and demanded a significant amount as moral compensation. Surprisingly, the court sided with her, ordering the hospital management to reinstate her and pay the compensation she sought. It seemed that everything was going exceptionally well for Mariana. She was free, back at her job, and had received 40,000 euros in moral compensation. However, news soon came from the prison that Maria had taken her own life by hanging herself with a bedsheet in her cell. She left behind a note detailing aspects of Diogo's perpetration that implicated her friend. Following this incident, the case was reopened and the victim's father filed an appeal, insisting that Finesco was as guilty as her accomplice. The Supreme Court only delivered the final verdict in June 2023, finding Mariana guilty of planning and carrying out the murder of Gonzalez, as well as dismembering his body and carjacking. Ultimately, she was sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of early release. Since then, she and her lawyer have attempted to file appeals twice, but so far all their appeals have been rejected. Story 1. In 2011, Indonesia witnessed several significant criminal cases, one of which attracted both national and international attention due to its complexity and impact on the country's legal system. One such case was the infamous the Sakini murder case, which occurred in Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, in 2011. This case involved a series of shocking events that led to the brutal murder of a prominent businesswoman. The victim, Maria Livia, was a successful entrepreneur who owned a popular boutique in one of the upscale shopping areas in Jakarta. She was well known for her social status and her charitable contributions, having donated to several orphanages and organizations that supported underprivileged children. Despite her public image, Maria's personal life was far more complicated and marred by conflicts and disputes that were not immediately apparent to the public. Maria Livia was married to a businessman named Dimas Soterio, who was also well known within Jakarta's elite social circle. However, their marriage had been troubled for years, with allegations of infidelity and financial disputes surfacing periodically. The couple had a daughter, Anita Soterio, who was a student at a private international school. Despite their ongoing issues, Maria and Dimas remained married, and their social appearances seemed normal, though rumors of their strained relationship continued to circulate. In the months leading up to the murder, several of Maria's close friends and colleagues noticed her becoming increasingly anxious and withdrawn. She had reportedly been receiving threatening phone calls and messages from an anonymous source, though she did not share much about it. Some believed that Maria was receiving these threats due to her business dealings, while others speculated that it could be related to her complicated marriage. On the evening of March 18, 2011, Maria was found dead in her luxury apartment in the Sakini area of central Jakarta. The scene was described as horrific. Maria had been severely beaten and stabbed multiple times. The police discovered her lifeless body in the living room, with signs of a struggle. There were no signs of forced entry into the apartment, leading investigators to suspect that the killer was someone familiar to the victim. The initial investigation pointed to several potential suspects, including family members, friends, and business associates. Dimas Soterio, Maria's husband, was quickly brought in for questioning. Dimas had been out of town on a business trip at the time of the murder, which gave him an alibi. However, his alibi was soon questioned when the police found evidence that suggested he may have been involved in some way. The police learned that Dimas had been in contact with several individuals prior to the murder, and there were signs that he may have been aware of the threats his wife had been receiving. Several witnesses came forward claiming to have seen Dimas at a cafe near his wife's apartment shortly before the murder took place. However, this evidence alone was not enough to conclusively implicate him. As the investigation continued, the police expanded their search to include other potential suspects. They questioned several of Maria's business associates and employees, but no solid leads were forthcoming. Meanwhile, the public became increasingly obsessed with the case, with many speculating about the true motives behind the murder. The turning point in the investigation came when forensic evidence revealed that a male DNA sample was found on Maria's clothing. This discovery led investigators to focus on individuals who may have been connected to her personal life. It was soon revealed that Maria had been having an affair with a young man named Randy Wibowo, a former employee of her boutique. Randy had been fired from the store a few months prior to the murder, but the two had reportedly remained in contact. Randy was brought in for questioning, and after several hours of interrogation, he eventually confessed to the crime. He revealed that he had been having an affair with Maria for several months, and the two had planned to run away together. However, Maria had recently informed Randy that she had decided to stay with her husband and that she would not leave Dimas for him. This revelation allegedly angered Randy, leading him to confront Maria on the night of the murder. According to Randy, the confrontation escalated when Maria refused to end her marriage, and in a fit of rage, he attacked her. He admitted to beating her with a blunt object before stabbing her multiple times. Randy also confessed to attempting to stage the scene to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. He claimed that he had hoped to cover up his crime by making it appear as though Maria had been murdered by an intruder. Randy's confession shocked both the investigators and the public. Many had initially believed that the crime was committed by someone closer to Maria, but it turned out that the murderer was someone who had once been a part of her inner circle. The case also highlighted the dangers of personal relationships gone wrong and the complexities of human emotions. The arrest of Randy Wibowo brought an end to one of the most high-profile murder investigations in Indonesia at the time. However, the case left a lasting impact on both the legal system and public perception of domestic violence and infidelity. It raised questions about how well the law could protect individuals from crimes driven by personal grievances, and how deep emotional turmoil could lead people to commit such horrific acts. The trial of Randy Wibowo was followed closely by the media, and he was eventually sentenced to life in prison for the brutal murder of Maria Livia. The case was widely discussed in Indonesia as a tragic example of how personal conflicts could escalate into violent crime. It also sparked conversations about the importance of addressing domestic issues before they spiral out of control, and about the role of law enforcement in preventing such crimes. The case of Maria Livia served as a sobering reminder of the fragility of human relationships and the potential for violence when emotions are left unchecked. It also demonstrated how even those who appear to have it all, wealth, social status, and success, can become victims of crimes driven by deeply personal and often hidden conflicts. As the legal process unfolded, the story of Maria's life and tragic end would continue to resonate with the people of Indonesia for years to come. This case remains one of the most notorious criminal cases in Indonesia's history from 2011, and it continues to be a subject of discussion in both legal circles and popular media, reflecting the complexity of human behavior and the darker side of relationships. As the investigation into the murder of Maria Livia progressed, the case began to draw significant attention, not only because of the brutality of the crime, but also due to the involvement of individuals who were considered part of Indonesia's upper class. Maria's status as a well-known entrepreneur, combined with the shocking nature of her death, highlighted the stark contrast between the lavish lifestyle she appeared to lead and the dark secrets that eventually came to light. Randy Wibowo's confession brought a moment of clarity to the case, but the subsequent legal process revealed deeper layers of complexity. Randy's motives for the murder were rooted in emotional dependency, rejection, and betrayal. In his trial, Randy admitted that he had become obsessively attached to Maria, despite the fact that their relationship had been far from stable. He revealed that after being fired from her boutique, he had struggled to find steady employment and had become financially dependent on Maria, who had been one of the few sources of support in his life. Randy felt abandoned by her when she decided to end the affair and return to her husband. This rejection, coupled with his escalating jealousy and frustration, led him to a breaking point. During the trial, Randy's defense lawyers attempted to argue that he had acted under a moment of intense emotional distress. They suggested that he had not premeditated the murder, but had been overcome by a surge of emotions when confronted with Maria's decision to remain with Demas. The defense team claimed that Randy had suffered from a form of emotional instability, which led him to make an impulsive decision that ended in tragedy. However, the prosecution contended that Randy's actions were deliberate, and that he had carefully planned the murder in order to escape the perceived humiliation of being rejected by Maria. The prosecution pointed out that Randy had taken specific steps to cover his tracks after committing the murder. He had wiped down the crime scene in an attempt to remove any fingerprints, and he had tried to stage the scene as if a robbery had taken place. The fact that he had attempted to flee the scene immediately after the crime was further evidence of his intent to avoid capture. The prosecution also highlighted Randy's behavior leading up to the murder, including his obsessive monitoring of Maria's activities and his frequent messages and phone calls to her, which had been a source of distress for the victim. The public's reaction to the trial was mixed. Some were sympathetic toward Randy, understanding that his emotional attachment to Maria had likely clouded his judgment, while others were repulsed by the brutality of his actions and the way he had violated the trust of someone who had once cared for him. The case sparked a broader conversation about the dangers of unhealthy attachments and emotional manipulation in relationships. Many in the public questioned how a person who had once been close to Maria could so easily turn into her killer. Family and friends of Maria Livia were devastated by the loss. In interviews and during the trial, they described Maria as a kind and generous person, someone who had always tried to help others. They spoke of her dedication to her daughter, Anita, and her drive to build a successful business that would secure a future for her family. Maria's close friend, Elisa Ganawin, who had known Maria for over a decade, spoke tearfully about how difficult it had been to come to terms with the loss. Elisa stated that Maria had always been a strong woman, yet her personal struggles had often been hidden behind her public persona. It was only in the months before the murder that Elisa had noticed Maria becoming more withdrawn, which made her worry about the difficulties Maria was facing in her marriage and personal life. The case was also a wake-up call for law enforcement regarding the prevalence of domestic issues, infidelity, and obsessive relationships within Indonesian society, especially among the urban elite. Many were shocked that someone from a high social class, with all the privileges that come with wealth and status, could fall victim to such a violent crime stemming from personal turmoil. It illustrated that these problems were not exclusive to any particular demographic and could happen to anyone, regardless of their outward appearances. The attention from the media only intensified as the trial unfolded, with various news outlets providing detailed reports about Randy's background, the dynamics of his relationship with Maria, and the details of his confession. The media coverage was relentless, with debates on whether Randy should be given a lighter sentence due to his emotional distress, or whether the severity of his crime warranted the maximum punishment. This media scrutiny was further amplified by public interest in the social dynamics of Maria's life and Randy's actions leading up to the murder. As the trial came to an end, the judge delivered a verdict that would make headlines across the country. Randy Waboa was found guilty of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. While some members of the public and his defense team were disappointed by the sentence, believing that his emotional distress should have played a more significant role in determining his punishment, others felt that justice had been served. Randy's sentence was seen as a message that emotional turmoil, however deep, could never justify the taking of another person's life. In the aftermath of the trial, there was a growing call for more robust mental health support and counseling services in Indonesia, particularly for those who experienced emotional crises stemming from rejection or interpersonal conflicts. The tragedy underscored the importance of addressing mental health issues early on, especially in relationships where emotional dependence can easily spiral into harmful behavior. Social workers and psychologists began speaking out about the need for better education on healthy relationships, emotional well-being, and managing jealousy and dependency. The Sakini murder case had a lasting effect on public discourse in Indonesia. It raised awareness about the potential dangers of emotional manipulation and unhealthy attachments, as well as the impact of infidelity on families. It also led to discussions about how the country's legal system could better handle crimes of passion and emotionally charged murders. While Maria Livia's death could never be undone, her case played a role in changing how people viewed and understood intimate partner violence and emotional abuse, ultimately encouraging individuals to seek help and intervention before situations escalated to violence. In the years that followed, the case remained a topic of interest in Indonesia, often cited in discussions of domestic violence, mental health, and the psychology behind violent crimes. As time passed, Randy's story became a cautionary tale, a tragic reminder of how unchecked emotions, a lack of communication, and unhealthy relationships could lead to irreversible consequences. It left a deep scar on the Indonesian public and served as a painful reminder that even those who seem to live the most glamorous and successful lives are not immune to the complexities of human emotion and personal struggle. As time passed, the aftermath of Maria Livia's murder continued to resonate across Indonesia, raising important questions about the country's societal norms, legal processes, and the unseen struggles that many individuals face behind closed doors. The case of the Sakini murder went beyond the courtroom, infiltrating public conversations and contributing to long-lasting shifts in attitudes toward relationships, emotional abuse, and mental health. However, the tragic death of Maria also left behind a shattered family and an unresolved emotional toll on those who were close to her. Maria's daughter, Anita Soterio, was left to cope with the loss of her mother at a young age. The emotional trauma she endured, compounded by the complex nature of the crime, proved difficult for her and the rest of Maria's family. While there were attempts to protect Anita from the media frenzy surrounding the trial, she, like many victims of similar crimes, had to come to terms with the trauma in her own way. The young girl's future was forever altered by the events of that fateful night, and it was evident that the ripples of her mother's death would affect her for the rest of her life. Maria's extended family also struggled with feelings of betrayal and loss. Her sister, Rina Livia, publicly expressed her shock and disbelief over the murder, noting how Maria had always been a protective and loving person. Rina shared in interviews that Maria had always tried to be a good role model for her daughter, and she had even made plans for the future, hoping to expand her business and continue her philanthropic work. The suddenness of the murder left a void that was impossible to fill, not only within the family, but also within the wider community that had admired Maria for her generosity. While the legal consequences were clear for Randy Waboa, the case also exposed the gaps within Indonesia's support systems for victims of domestic violence and emotional abuse. The fact that Maria had been receiving threatening messages and phone calls leading up to the murder showed that there were warning signs of potential danger. Yet, there was no system in place to intervene or offer her the protection she needed. This realization led to public calls for greater awareness and resources dedicated to preventing violence in relationships and providing adequate support for individuals suffering from emotional abuse or manipulative relationships. In response to the growing public concern over domestic violence, several non-governmental organizations, NGOs, and mental health advocates began pushing for stronger legislation and support services. They argued that more comprehensive education about healthy relationships, recognizing signs of emotional manipulation, and providing counseling services to those in toxic or abusive situations were necessary to prevent future tragedies like the Sakini murder. Furthermore, the case brought to light the need for a broader understanding of the impact of financial dependency and social pressures on individuals' emotional well-being. The legal community also reflected on the implications of this case in terms of how domestic violence and emotional abuse were treated within the Indonesian justice system. While Randy Wibowo's life sentence was seen as a step toward justice, many questioned whether the penalties for crimes of passion were sufficiently strong and whether enough attention was paid to the psychological factors at play. Some legal experts argued that the court system often overlooked the emotional or mental distress that individuals like Randy may be experiencing, which can contribute to their violent actions. This line of thinking prompted new debates about mental health evaluations and how they could be integrated into criminal trials. Supporters of this idea argued that understanding the mental state of a defendant could help to create more appropriate sentences and rehabilitation programs. The goal, they contended, should not only be punitive but also restorative, helping individuals confront their emotional turmoil and heal from the underlying issues that led them to commit such acts. While these discussions were taking place in the legal and public spheres, the case also highlighted broader social dynamics within Indonesia's elite circles. Many were shocked to learn that someone from Maria's social class could fall victim to such a brutal act. The case served as a reminder that social status, wealth, and success did not guarantee immunity from emotional crises or domestic strife. Maria's story resonated with many people across different socio-economic backgrounds, revealing how universal the complexities of personal relationships could be. In the years that followed the trial, Maria's murder continued to be discussed in both legal and sociological studies, often cited as a tragic example of the consequences of unaddressed emotional distress and domestic turmoil. The case would go on to serve as a case study in law schools and psychological circles, particularly as it highlighted the potential dangers of toxic relationships and the need for stronger emotional support systems. It also emphasized the importance of mental health awareness in the context of intimate partner violence. In the media, Maria's story was revisited many times. Documentaries, news specials, and even books were published about her life, her tragic death, and the trial that followed. The case became a symbol of the dangers of unaddressed emotional manipulation and the complexities of modern relationships. Her story also sparked conversations about women's safety, not only in the home, but also in their personal relationships. Maria's tragic end served as a stark reminder that domestic violence can take many forms, whether physical, emotional, or psychological, and it is not always easy to identify or prevent. While Randy Wibowo's fate was sealed in court, the case of the Sakini murder ultimately underscored the urgent need for a national conversation about the importance of mental health care, the recognition of abusive relationships, and the societal obligations to address these issues before they escalate into violence. Indonesia's legal and social institutions faced increasing pressure to adapt to the changing dynamics of relationships and domestic violence, with many advocating for stronger protections and intervention programs. The impact of the case would also be felt in the years that followed, as Indonesian society began to place greater emphasis on the importance of mental health, emotional well-being, and the protection of vulnerable individuals in toxic relationships. The tragic loss of Maria Livia served as both a warning and a call to action. Though her death was a senseless tragedy, the lessons learned from her story would eventually play a role in shaping a more open, supportive, and aware society, one that no longer ignored the complexities of the human heart, but rather sought to understand and address them before they could destroy lives. Through this painful journey, the Sakini murder case became not only an essential chapter in Indonesia's criminal history, but also a catalyst for social change, opening the door for greater awareness of emotional abuse, mental health, and the dark undercurrents that sometimes exist in even the most outwardly perfect relationships. The story of Maria's life and death was no longer just about a brutal crime, but about the broader lessons it imparted on a society striving to confront the hidden struggles that can devastate lives in silence. Let's jump to next story. Story 2. In 2011, one of the most high-profile and tragic criminal cases that captured the attention of Indonesia was the Munir case. While the death of Munir Sedlib, an Indonesian human rights activist, occurred back in 2004, the subsequent investigations and legal battles carried on into 2011, revealing more complexities and contributing to the ongoing struggle for justice. Munir's case remained a deeply significant issue in Indonesia for years after his death, with public interest growing throughout the years as new revelations surfaced about the perpetrators and the possible involvement of government officials. Munir was well known for his tireless work in exposing human rights abuses, particularly those committed by the Indonesian military during the East Timor conflict in the late 1990s. He was the founder of Impartial, an organization that advocated for human rights and fought for accountability for those responsible for various violations. His advocacy for justice and truth made him a target of the state, and his murder was widely seen as an attempt to silence a powerful voice for human rights. On September 7, 2004, Munir boarded a Garuda Indonesia flight to Amsterdam to attend a meeting in Europe. However, he was never able to make it. During the flight, Munir fell ill and passed away. The cause of death was initially believed to be a heart attack, but upon closer examination, it was determined that Munir had been poisoned with arsenic. Arsenic poisoning is a slow and painful way to die. It disrupts the body's internal systems, causing organ failure and ultimately death. Munir's sudden and unexpected death was a shock to his family, friends, and colleagues. It didn't take long for suspicion to arise surrounding the cause of death. Many believe that Munir's death was not just a tragic accident, but a deliberate act to eliminate a vocal critic of the government and military. The news of Munir's death sparked widespread outrage in Indonesia and abroad. His supporters, human rights groups, and civil society organizations quickly began to demand an investigation into the circumstances surrounding his death. They were adamant that the Indonesian government, with its history of military control and corruption, had a hand in the murder. Despite the pressure for accountability, the investigation initially faltered, and the case became one of the most controversial and unresolved in modern Indonesian history. The Indonesian authorities, at first, were reluctant to acknowledge the possibility that Munir had been murdered. They initially claimed that the cause of his death was a natural one, but as more evidence came to light, the narrative began to shift. In the months following Munir's death, it was revealed that there had been irregularities in the way Garuda Indonesia had handled the situation. It turned out that Munir had been seated next to an airline steward, Poltak Tampubulan, who was later found to be connected to a network that was involved in the plot to poison Munir. In 2005, the investigation began to take a more serious turn. The authorities arrested Poltak Tampubulan, the flight attendant who was working on the flight during Munir's last trip. Tampubulan admitted during his questioning that he had been given a bottle of orange juice to deliver to Munir on the flight, but he claimed he did not know that it had been poisoned with arsenic. While he was initially considered a pawn in the crime, investigators soon began to suspect that the case was much larger than just a flight attendant's involvement. The investigation turned its focus to Garuda Indonesia, which raised more questions about the airline's role in the murder. It became apparent that several people within Garuda were complicit in the crime, and the investigation uncovered connections between the airline staff and individuals with close ties to the Indonesian government and military. In the early stages of the investigation, it seemed as though some individuals were trying to cover up the murder or mislead the authorities by creating false reports about the events leading to Munir's death. By 2006, the Indonesian police had arrested and charged Poltak Tampubulan along with a senior Garuda official, Indra Setiawan, who was suspected of being involved in orchestrating the murder. Setiawan was believed to have played a key role in setting up the conditions for Munir's poisoning. Both men were tried and convicted in 2008 for their roles in the murder. However, their convictions raised more questions than answers. The case was far from closed, and there was a growing sense of frustration within the Indonesian public over the slow pace of justice. Despite these convictions, many people felt that the true masterminds behind Munir's death had not been brought to justice. The lack of transparency in the investigation, coupled with the apparent failure to address the involvement of high-ranking officials, led to widespread skepticism. Activists, lawyers, and journalists continued to press for a full investigation, and for the people who ordered the murder to be held accountable. In 2011, 7 years after Munir's death, the case took another unexpected turn. New evidence surfaced that implicated even higher-ranking officials within the Indonesian government and military. Investigative journalists and human rights organizations began to uncover documents that suggested that Munir's murder was not only a personal act of vengeance, but also part of a larger, coordinated effort by powerful figures within the government to eliminate a dangerous critic. Munir had been working on a report that linked senior military officers to human rights abuses in East Timor and other regions, which made him a target for those who wanted to protect their positions of power. The revelation of this new information reignited calls for further investigation, and the Indonesian government was once again put under pressure to reveal the full extent of its involvement in the murder. Many people believed that the authorities had deliberately obstructed the investigation and protected those at the top who had orchestrated Munir's assassination. At this point, human rights groups, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, began to voice their concern over the Indonesian government's failure to bring those truly responsible to justice. In 2011, the trial of Azahari and Nur Huda Ismail, 2 men linked to the assassination plot, began to draw attention again, as they were suspected to have been involved in facilitating Munir's death. These revelations kept the case alive in the public consciousness, with human rights groups and activists continuing to call for justice. As the case progressed, there were further criticisms of how the Indonesian legal system had handled the investigation and trial. Many in the legal community argued that the lack of urgency and thoroughness in the case was a reflection of deeper issues within the Indonesian justice system. Some pointed to corruption, while others suspected that influential individuals had used their power to keep the investigation from reaching its full potential. Public trust in the government's ability to ensure justice for Munir continued to erode. Despite all these complications and setbacks, the murder of Munir Sedilib continued to shape Indonesian society and its pursuit of justice for human rights abuses. Munir's death marked a significant turning point for human rights activism in Indonesia, as his murder exposed the lengths to which some would go to silence dissent. It also laid bare the challenges facing the country's legal and political systems when it came to dealing with high-profile cases involving powerful individuals. As 2011 came to a close, Munir's legacy lived on, not just as a symbol of the struggle for justice, but as a reminder of the ongoing fight for truth in a country still grappling with its past. As 2011 progressed, the public's demand for justice in Munir's case remained strong. The case was a focal point for the Indonesian human rights community, with various organizations continuing to press for the investigation to be reopened, and for those truly responsible for Munir's death to be held accountable. The push for justice was not just limited to the country's borders. International organizations such as Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and the United Nations, as well as foreign governments, continued to call on Indonesia to ensure that the case was fully investigated and the perpetrators brought to justice. Munir's family also remained vocal in their quest for justice. His widow, Siti Masrafah, and his daughter, Alia Munir, along with his friends and colleagues, repeatedly made public statements expressing their disappointment with the slow pace of the investigation and the lack of closure. They were firm in their belief that the case was far from resolved. Siti Masrafah, in particular, took on a leadership role in ensuring that Munir's legacy continued to be remembered. She became a strong advocate for human rights, not only in Indonesia but also on the international stage. In 2011, she received the Magsaysay Award, an honor that recognized her dedication to her husband's cause and her continued fight for human rights in Indonesia. Despite the legal challenges, the Indonesian National Commission on Human Rights, Komnas HAM, continued to work on the case, calling for a deeper investigation into the role of high-ranking officials in Munir's death. In 2011, the Commission suggested that there were still unanswered questions regarding the involvement of certain military figures and intelligence officials. The Commission's findings and recommendations were pivotal, as they suggested the existence of a covert operation designed to silence Munir due to his investigations into military atrocities in East Timor and his criticism of government policies. One key figure who continued to be scrutinized was Budi Santoso, a former intelligence officer with known ties to Garuda Indonesia and the military. Santoso's connection to the case was controversial, as some sources suggested that he was involved in planning and carrying out the murder, and may have had connections to higher levels of government. The evidence against Santoso was circumstantial but compelling. In 2011, his name resurfaced as new documents and testimonies suggested that he had played a role in the conspiracy. His involvement, if proven, would indicate that the murder of Munir was not just an isolated act, but part of a broader attempt to suppress dissent against the military and the government. Santoso, however, continued to deny any involvement in Munir's death. As the investigation continued, it became clear that political corruption and the military-industrial complex had been major factors that hindered the full resolution of the case. The Indonesian government's reluctance to pursue further investigations was seen by many as a deliberate cover-up. Numerous activists and journalists voiced their suspicions about the systemic failure of the justice system, which many believed had been compromised by powerful political figures who were afraid of the implications that the truth about Munir's murder would reveal. This belief in political interference was exacerbated by the fact that high-ranking officials, such as former President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, were publicly reticent to provide full access to documents or support further inquiries. Despite the setbacks, 2011 marked a shift in public sentiment as more people began to rally around the cause. Public demonstrations were organized by student groups and civil society organizations, demanding the Indonesian government reopen the investigation into Munir's murder. They argued that to truly heal from the country's violent past, particularly from the atrocities committed in East Timor and the 1998 riots, Indonesia needed to confront its history of human rights violations and bring those responsible to justice. These protests, which were organized in cities like Jakarta and Yogyakarta, drew attention to the ongoing impunity of the perpetrators of violence and the need for accountability. As more details emerged about the individuals who were involved in Munir's murder, it became increasingly clear that the crime had been carried out in a way that would have required significant resources and coordination. The people responsible for poisoning Munir were not acting alone, but as part of a network of individuals who sought to eliminate a voice of dissent. It was suggested that the murder had been planned for months before it was carried out, indicating that there had been a deliberate and calculated effort to silence Munir once and for all. Among those who were implicated in the crime was Haryadi, a man believed to have been an intermediary between the masterminds of the plot and the individuals within Garuda Indonesia who carried out the operation. Haryadi was linked to a group of individuals who had previously been associated with military intelligence, and there were rumors that he had been directly involved in both providing the arsenic and orchestrating the placement of the poisoned drink on the flight. While Haryadi was never formally charged with the crime, his name continued to appear in leaked documents and testimonies. The question of who ordered Munir's murder remained a key point of contention. In 2011, investigators and human rights groups began to speculate that the murder had been ordered at the highest levels of the Indonesian government. Some believed that the motivation behind the killing was not only Munir's activism, but also the growing threat he posed to those in power due to his investigation into military crimes. By 2011, there was a widespread belief that Munir's death had been politically motivated and that high-ranking figures within the military and intelligence agencies had ordered his murder in an effort to prevent him from exposing the government's dark secrets. Throughout the year, foreign governments and international human rights organizations continued to express their concern over the lack of accountability in the case. In particular, the United States, which had supported Indonesia during its transition to democracy, called on Indonesia to demonstrate its commitment to justice by fully investigating the case. The international community kept a close watch on the investigation, with hopes that it would signal Indonesia's willingness to confront past human rights abuses and to strengthen the rule of law in the country. By the end of 2011, the case of Munir's murder had not yet reached a conclusion. However, it had successfully kept the issue of human rights violations alive in public discourse. Munir's name continued to be honored by his supporters, and his family remained committed to seeking justice for his untimely death. The investigation into Munir's murder was far from over, but it served as a symbol of the ongoing struggle for accountability and human rights in Indonesia, a struggle that had only become more urgent as the country navigated its post-authoritarian era. The case of Munir Saidalib proved that the fight for justice was not always easy, but it was a fight worth pursuing, one that could ultimately bring about change in a society that was still healing from its past. As the years passed, the demand for justice in the Munir case persisted, but progress remained slow. By 2011, there was growing frustration within both Indonesia and the international community regarding the continued lack of accountability for those behind Munir's murder. The case was emblematic of the wider issue of human rights abuses in Indonesia, which had remained largely unaddressed since the end of the Suharto regime. Munir's death highlighted the ongoing impunity enjoyed by certain factions within the military and political elite, who were believed to have played a role in orchestrating his assassination. The fight for justice in Munir's case had become not only a matter of seeking closure for his family, but also a symbol of the country's struggle to confront its past. In Indonesia, civil society groups, activists, and lawyers continued to lead the charge in advocating for accountability. The Indonesian Human Rights Commission, Komnas HAM, remained actively involved in pushing for a more thorough investigation, and its recommendations to the authorities were increasingly difficult to ignore. At the same time, other organizations such as Impartial, Contras, and Indonesia Corruption Watch kept the issue in the public eye, organizing events and campaigns to demand that the government take meaningful action to uncover the truth. However, the sense of urgency was not shared by all. The Indonesian government was slow to act on the mounting pressure. Political realities and ongoing resistance from powerful figures within the military and intelligence services continued to stall any substantial progress. Many believed that these powerful entities were deliberately obstructing the investigation to prevent a deeper probe into the military's role in the country's human rights abuses, especially during the East Timor conflict and the events surrounding the 1998 student protests that led to the downfall of the Suharto regime. In the face of this stagnation, Munir's family remained determined to keep his memory alive. His widow, Siti Masrifah, and their daughter, Alia Munir, continued to be outspoken in their calls for justice. Siti Masrifah dedicated much of her life to continuing her husband's legacy and advocating for human rights in Indonesia. She founded the Munir Foundation, which aimed to honor her husband's life and work while continuing the fight for justice in his case. She also began to speak internationally, urging foreign governments to apply pressure on Indonesia to address its human rights record and to ensure that Munir's murder was not forgotten. Throughout 2011, Siti Masrifah became an increasingly prominent figure in human rights circles, attending international human rights conferences and receiving recognition for her perseverance and courage. She was also invited to speak at various international events, including meetings with foreign diplomats, where she highlighted the ongoing injustice faced by her family and the failure of the Indonesian government to fully investigate her husband's death. Despite these efforts, the official response from the Indonesian government remained tepid. President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, who had been in power since 2004, had made public commitments to address human rights abuses, but his administration's failure to act decisively in Munir's case revealed the deep-rooted issues of political influence and corruption within the government. Many human rights advocates pointed out that the case exposed the reluctance of Indonesia's political leadership to confront its history of state-sponsored violence and cover-ups. International pressure also grew as the world watched Indonesia's handling of the case. Foreign governments, particularly those in Europe and the United States, had long been critical of the Indonesian government's failure to provide justice for Munir. In 2011, the European Union and United States reiterated their calls for a thorough investigation and accountability, demanding that Indonesia ensure that human rights violations were addressed and that those responsible for Munir's murder were held accountable. In parallel, there was growing attention on the role of the media in keeping Munir's case alive. Journalists in Indonesia and abroad played a crucial role in investigating and reporting on the developments in the case, even as it became clear that some officials were attempting to suppress the truth. Investigative journalists uncovered new details about the alleged involvement of military officials, intelligence officers, and other government figures in the plot to murder Munir. These revelations, though not always officially confirmed, further fueled public outrage and kept the case in the spotlight. Independent media outlets such as Tempo, the Jakarta Post, and Compass were instrumental in exposing these new findings and raising awareness about the flaws in the investigation. By the end of 2011, Munir's murder had become a rallying cry for those seeking justice for past human rights violations in Indonesia. His case was increasingly viewed as a litmus test for the country's commitment to upholding democratic values, the rule of law, and human rights. The fight for justice for Munir, a man whose work had exposed the harsh realities of Indonesia's military operations, was also about ensuring that the nation did not forget the victims of state violence and corruption. Even though many key figures remained free, and the investigation continued to face numerous hurdles, there were moments of progress. In 2011, the Indonesian National Police launched new efforts to re-examine the case, though it was unclear whether these efforts would result in new charges or significant breakthroughs. The police began to focus on those who might have been complicit in the wider conspiracy to eliminate Munir, as well as the individuals who had provided logistical support in carrying out the crime. It was hoped that these efforts would eventually shed light on the higher-level figures behind the murder. The legacy of Munir also began to evolve throughout 2011, as more and more Indonesians began to embrace his story. His life and work became synonymous with the struggle for human rights in Indonesia. Schools, universities, and various institutions began to hold seminars and events dedicated to his memory. He became a symbol not just of resistance to oppression, but also of the hope for a more just and transparent Indonesia. While the full truth about Munir's murder had not yet been revealed, it was clear that his death had sparked a movement that would not be easily silenced. Munir's tragic fate served as a powerful reminder of the cost of speaking out against the abuses of the powerful. It also acted as a call to action for all Indonesians, urging them to continue fighting for justice in the face of powerful opposition. The struggle for Munir's justice was far from over, but as long as his legacy lived on, so too would the fight for truth, accountability, and human rights in Indonesia. The case of Munir Said Dalib, as of 2011, had not only become a key moment in Indonesian criminal history, but it also set a precedent for the ongoing struggle for justice in the face of state-sponsored impunity. The effort to expose the truth behind Munir's death was symbolic of Indonesia's broader need to confront its dark history and ensure that the atrocities of the past were not repeated. Munir's life and death, as painful as it was, had awakened a nation to the importance of speaking truth to power and the need for unrelenting perseverance in the fight for justice. Let's jump to next story. Story 3. One of the most notorious criminal cases that shocked Indonesia in 2012 was the murder of Angeline, a young girl from Bali. This case not only exposed a dark chapter of child abuse and violence, but also led to widespread national outrage and highlighted serious flaws in the Indonesian legal and social systems. The incident captured the attention of the public, media, and human rights organizations alike, becoming a focal point in the fight against child abuse in the country. Angeline was an 8-year-old girl who lived in Denpasar, the capital of Bali. She was adopted by a couple, Maid Ardiati and her husband Ketut Jaya. Angeline's biological mother had given her up when she was just a baby, and the couple had been raising her ever since. According to early reports, Angeline's adoption was supposed to provide her with a safe and loving home. Unfortunately, it turned out to be a tragic nightmare. In May 2015, Angeline's disappearance sparked immediate concern. Her adoptive mother, Ardiati, claimed that the young girl had gone missing from their house, prompting a police investigation. What initially seemed like a case of a missing child soon turned into something far more sinister. The police discovered disturbing inconsistencies in Ardiati's account of the events and began to dig deeper into her background and the household situation. The investigation revealed that Angeline had been subjected to extreme physical abuse and neglect over a long period of time. Neighbors reported hearing loud noises from the house, and some even claimed to have seen signs of injuries on Angeline's body in the days leading up to her disappearance. Investigators soon discovered that Angeline had been kept in isolated conditions, locked in a room, and frequently beaten by her adoptive mother. The signs of torture and abuse were clear and shocking. The case became even more disturbing when police learned of the extent of the abuse that Angeline had suffered. Ardiati was found to have not only physically abused the young girl, but had also allegedly tortured her emotionally and psychologically. There were reports that Angeline had been forced to sleep in a small, windowless room, deprived of food and water for extended periods, and subjected to physical punishments for the smallest infractions. Ardiati's behavior seemed to have been not just cruel, but methodical, with the young girl's suffering being a part of the daily routine in the household. Soon after Angeline was reported missing, the police expanded their investigation. They began questioning everyone who might have information about her disappearance, including neighbors, friends, and relatives. Angeline's biological mother was also interviewed, and it was revealed that she had been unaware of the abuse taking place in the home. She expressed deep shock and disbelief when she learned about the condition her daughter had been in. It was clear that, despite being adopted by a seemingly stable family, Angeline had endured unimaginable hardships. After days of investigation, the authorities were able to piece together the truth behind Angeline's death. It was uncovered that Angeline had been killed by her adoptive mother, Maid Ardiati, in an act of rage and frustration. Ardiati admitted to having beaten Angeline to death, and then hiding her body in a shallow grave in the yard of their house. The abuse had reportedly escalated to a point where Ardiati lost control and murdered Angeline in a fit of anger. The news of Angeline's tragic death spread quickly throughout Indonesia, and the case drew widespread condemnation. The public was outraged, with many expressing shock and disbelief that such brutality could occur within a family. This crime raised serious questions about the safety of children in Indonesia, especially those in the foster and adoptive care systems. Many wondered how such abuse could have gone unnoticed for so long, despite neighbors' reports and the girl's suffering. The case was also a wake-up call for the Indonesian government to address the issue of child protection and to ensure that more rigorous systems were put in place to prevent such tragedies from occurring again. In the aftermath of Angeline's death, Indonesian authorities came under intense scrutiny. Many wondered how such an incident could have occurred without the intervention of social services or law enforcement. It was revealed that the authorities had been alerted about the abuse in Angeline's home years before her death, but no action had been taken to protect her. The failure of both local authorities and the adoption system to detect and stop the abuse became a central point of discussion in the aftermath of the murder. The case also highlighted the need for better monitoring of adoptive families and the importance of regular checks to ensure that children are being treated properly. It was clear that the adoption process in Indonesia lacked sufficient oversight, and children like Angeline were vulnerable to being placed in harmful environments. The public outrage surrounding Angeline's death prompted calls for reforms to the child protection system, including more robust regulations for adoptions, better training for social workers, and increased attention to the welfare of children in care. Human rights organizations, such as Save the Children Indonesia, began to speak out about the inadequacies of the child protection system and called for stronger legal protections for children in Indonesia. They argued that the country's existing laws on child abuse were not being effectively enforced, and that there was a lack of public awareness about the rights of children. The tragedy of Angeline's death brought these issues to the forefront of the national conversation and forced the Indonesian government to confront the gaps in its child protection infrastructure. In the wake of the murder, the trial of Maid Ardiati was closely followed by the media and the public. As the case progressed, Ardiati was charged with premeditated murder, and her actions were condemned by the court as heinous and unforgivable. The trial served as a reminder of the tragic consequences that can result from neglecting the welfare of children and failing to provide them with the protection they need. Angeline's death also raised questions about the larger issue of domestic violence in Indonesia. Many advocates pointed out that while physical and psychological abuse were often seen as private matters within families, this case illustrated how such violence could escalate into something far more deadly. The Indonesian government faced increasing pressure to take stronger action against domestic violence and to establish better support systems for victims of abuse. As the trial of Ardiati continued, there was a growing national conversation about how Indonesia could improve its laws and systems to protect vulnerable children. Many hoped that the case would not only serve as a call for justice for Angeline, but also spark meaningful changes in the country's approach to child welfare. Despite the tragic nature of Angeline's story, her death became a powerful catalyst for reform in Indonesia, with the hope that such a tragedy would never be allowed to happen again. By the end of 2012, the case of Angeline had not only captured the nation's attention, but had also brought important issues surrounding child abuse and protection to the forefront of public debate. The efforts of activists, lawyers, and human rights organizations to raise awareness about the need for stronger child protection laws in Indonesia would continue for years to come. Angeline's memory became a symbol of the urgent need to protect children from harm and ensure that those responsible for their abuse were held accountable. The trial of Maid Ardiati, the adoptive mother of Angeline, became one of the most high-profile legal proceedings in Indonesia in 2012. As the case unfolded, the public's shock and horror grew at the details of the abuse Angeline had endured. The courtroom became the stage for a tragic story that exposed deep systemic failures in child protection as well as the indifference of authorities who had failed to intervene despite several warning signs. During the trial, it was revealed that Angeline's suffering had been ongoing for years. According to testimonies, her adoptive mother, Ardiati, had subjected her to physical abuse since she was a young child. Neighbors testified that they frequently heard screams and cries coming from the household. Some reported seeing Angeline with visible signs of bruising and other injuries, but they did not know the full extent of the abuse. Many in the community were unaware of how bad things had gotten behind closed doors. Even more disturbing was the fact that Ardiati had isolated Angeline from the outside world. The young girl was not allowed to play with other children or attend school regularly. It was revealed that Ardiati had kept Angeline confined to a small, poorly lit room for extended periods of time, further exacerbating the child's sense of loneliness and despair. There were also reports that Angeline was forced to perform household chores without adequate food, rest, or affection. One of the most difficult aspects of the case was learning that despite the evidence of neglect and abuse, no formal intervention had been made. Several neighbors had tried to report their suspicions to the authorities, but their complaints were either dismissed or ignored. This tragic oversight underscored the failures of the child protection system in Indonesia at the time, where reporting mechanisms were weak, and social workers often lacked the resources or authority to take immediate action in situations involving child abuse. It raised serious concerns about how children in vulnerable situations were being monitored and whether their rights were adequately protected by law. The investigation into the circumstances surrounding Angeline's death continued to shed light on Ardiati's cruel actions. The police discovered that after the murder, Ardiati had attempted to cover up the crime by hiding Angeline's body in a shallow grave in the yard. To conceal her crime, Ardiati initially claimed that Angeline had gone missing. She fabricated a story about her adoptive daughter running away, sparking an extensive search by the police and the local community. However, when the investigation into her disappearance deepened, Ardiati's lies began to unravel. Police found discrepancies in her statements and finally uncovered the horrifying truth of what had happened inside her home. In the courtroom, Ardiati's defense team argued that she had not intended to kill Angeline, but rather acted out of temporary emotional distress. However, the evidence presented during the trial suggested otherwise. Expert witnesses testified that the injuries sustained by Angeline were consistent with long-term abuse, and that the physical trauma she endured was severe. It was clear that her death had not been a momentary outburst of rage, but rather the culmination of months or possibly years of ongoing mistreatment. The defense's argument did little to sway the public or the court, as many were already convinced that the adoptive mother had not only murdered Angeline, but had systematically tortured her over the years. The investigation and trial also uncovered disturbing facts about the lack of oversight regarding adoption practices in Indonesia. At the time of the murder, there were no clear mechanisms in place to monitor the welfare of adopted children. The process of adoption itself was often marred by corruption and a lack of proper vetting for prospective adoptive parents. In Ardiati's case, there were no regular checks or follow-up visits by social workers, which allowed her to continue her abuse without any intervention from authorities. This flaw in the adoption system became one of the most important lessons drawn from the case. The tragedy of Angeline's death also sparked debates about the broader issue of domestic violence in Indonesia. The country had long struggled with a culture of silence around domestic abuse, where victims, especially children, often suffered in isolation, unable to seek help. Social and cultural taboos around family privacy and a reluctance to intervene in domestic matters had allowed perpetrators of violence to act with impunity. In Angeline's case, the combination of poor social services, ineffective law enforcement, and a culture of non-interference allowed her adoptive mother to continue her abuse unchecked until it was too late. Following Angeline's death, many organizations and activists called for urgent reforms to address the issue of child abuse and domestic violence in Indonesia. Groups such as Komnas Perempuan, National Commission on Violence Against Women, and Save the Children Indonesia became prominent advocates for better laws and better implementation of those laws to protect children. They called for the government to strengthen child protection systems and to ensure that the welfare of children was a top priority. The case became a rallying point for those demanding stronger legal protections for children, as well as better resources for local authorities to prevent and respond to incidents of child abuse. In addition to these reforms, there was growing demand for the training of social workers and other officials to better identify signs of abuse and take prompt action when necessary. Many pointed out that the failure to prevent Angeline's abuse was partly due to the lack of proper training for those who were supposed to protect her. Some even suggested that local police and social workers were overwhelmed with cases or lacked the skills to effectively address the complex issue of child abuse. Angeline's case was also an important turning point in the Indonesian public's awareness of the country's child welfare issues. Media coverage of the trial and the gruesome details of her life and death led to public outcry. The case was widely reported in newspapers, on television, and on social media, sparking a national conversation about the need for greater child protection. The discussions around Angeline's murder became a catalyst for the government to reconsider its approach to child welfare. As the trial drew to a close, the verdict brought some sense of justice to those who had followed the case closely. Maid Ardiati was found guilty of premeditated murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. While the sentence was seen as a form of justice for Angeline, it could not undo the harm she had suffered or bring back the young girl's life. The case remained a painful reminder of the vulnerability of children in Indonesia and the urgent need for systemic changes to prevent such a tragedy from happening again. In the aftermath of the trial, calls for a national child protection policy intensified. Many believed that the government needed to take immediate action to overhaul Indonesia's child welfare laws and practices to ensure that future cases of abuse would not go unnoticed. The case of Angeline had exposed the harsh reality that many children were not safe in their homes, even when they were placed in adoptive families. The tragedy would continue to serve as a painful reminder of the work that still needed to be done to safeguard the rights and well-being of Indonesia's children. As 2012 came to a close, the impact of Angeline's case continued to resonate throughout the country. The public's anger over the brutality of her murder and the failures of the child protection system resulted in calls for nationwide reforms that would hopefully prevent such a tragedy from repeating itself. It was a moment of reckoning for Indonesia, one that highlighted the need to protect its most vulnerable citizens, the children, from abuse, neglect, and violence. As 2012 came to a close, the murder of Angeline remained an emblematic case that spurred calls for urgent reforms in Indonesia's child protection system. The country, deeply shaken by the brutality of the crime, found itself confronting its deeply ingrained issues regarding child welfare, adoption procedures, and domestic violence. While the trial of Maid Ardiati, Angeline's adoptive mother, had ended with a conviction, it was clear that Angeline's death had exposed larger systemic issues that demanded serious attention. The outrage surrounding Angeline's case gave momentum to long-standing demands for the strengthening of child protection laws and the creation of a more effective and accessible child welfare infrastructure. In the wake of the trial, the public, along with non-governmental organizations, NGOs, human rights advocates, and child protection agencies, began to push the government for substantial policy changes. Many argued that the Indonesian government needed to implement stronger regulations on adoption procedures, better monitoring of adoptive families, and more thorough vetting of adoptive parents. Angeline's case was a stark reminder that the state had failed to ensure that children placed in adoptive families were not subjected to abuse. One of the most significant conversations to emerge from Angeline's murder was the need to improve the training and accountability of social workers and local authorities involved in child protection. Several experts pointed out that the social workers, who were supposed to be monitoring the welfare of adopted children, were not adequately trained to recognize signs of abuse or intervene in situations of neglect. In Angeline's case, the warnings from neighbors and even prior complaints had gone unnoticed by authorities, underscoring the need for a more proactive and efficient response system. Activists and advocates called for better resourced and well-trained social services to identify cases of abuse early and prevent the escalation of violence. Furthermore, the case exposed the lack of a national, standardized approach to child welfare in Indonesia. Local governments in different regions had varying levels of capacity and commitment when it came to child protection, and this lack of consistency meant that children living in different parts of the country faced vastly different standards of care and protection. Many regions lacked sufficient social workers, and the legal infrastructure designed to protect children was often underfunded and overburdened. In Angeline's case, these gaps had allowed the abuse to go unnoticed for far too long, ultimately resulting in her tragic death. Child protection, many argued, needed to become a national priority, with a concerted effort to improve coordination among various governmental agencies and civil society organizations. On a societal level, the case also sparked a shift in public attitudes regarding domestic violence and child abuse. Historically, Indonesia had operated with a culture of silence when it came to family matters, with many individuals reluctant to interfere in situations involving domestic abuse, especially in private homes. Angeline's case served as a wake-up call for the public that the silence around domestic violence and child abuse must end. The media played an essential role in shining a spotlight on the issue, with extensive coverage of the trial and investigation that helped raise awareness of the extent of the problem. The case revealed how cultural norms and the reluctance to intervene in family matters could enable child abuse to persist, sometimes unnoticed for years. In the aftermath of the trial, public discussions became centered not only on the brutal death of Angeline, but also on the psychological and emotional toll that such abuse takes on children. The horrific nature of her suffering highlighted how abuse, especially when it occurs over extended periods, can cause irreparable damage to a child's mental health. Many experts pointed out that the abuse Angeline endured before her death would have had long-lasting effects on her emotional well-being, regardless of whether or not she survived. This brought attention to the need for more comprehensive support for child victims of abuse, including mental health care, and the importance of ensuring that children had access to support networks outside of their families. The case also prompted greater scrutiny of adoption laws in Indonesia. It became clear that the adoption process was inadequate, with no standardized oversight or post-adoption checks to ensure the safety of children. Although there are legal guidelines in place for adoption in Indonesia, the system lacked the necessary oversight to prevent abuse from occurring in adoptive homes. NGOs and child rights activists began advocating for the government to reform the adoption process, emphasizing the need for thorough background checks of potential adoptive parents and home visits after adoption to ensure that the child was being well treated. Many called for independent monitoring bodies to oversee the adoption process and prevent children from being placed in harmful environments. As the case progressed, it became clear that Angeline's story was part of a larger pattern of systemic failures in Indonesia regarding child welfare. Child protection policies were often not enforced, and public awareness of children's rights was limited. In addition, the legal system often failed to hold perpetrators of child abuse accountable for their actions. Although the conviction of Ardiati was a significant step in holding one individual responsible for a heinous act, it did not address the wider societal issues that allowed her to abuse Angeline for so long. The Indonesian legal system, many argued, needed to be strengthened, and laws relating to child abuse and neglect needed to be enforced more consistently across the country. International human rights organizations also weighed in, pointing out that Indonesia was a signatory of several international treaties and conventions aimed at protecting children, including the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. However, despite these international obligations, the country was criticized for its lack of actionable reforms and its failure to adequately protect vulnerable children from abuse. Global pressure continued to mount for Indonesia to improve its child welfare system and ensure that future tragedies, like the one suffered by Angeline, could be prevented. In the months following the trial, Angeline's case continued to reverberate in Indonesian society, leading to grassroots movements and community-led initiatives aimed at raising awareness about child abuse and domestic violence. Advocacy groups organized campaigns to educate the public about the signs of abuse and how to report it. Schools, community centers, and religious organizations began to incorporate child protection into their programs, fostering a culture of responsibility and action when it came to safeguarding the well-being of children. Despite the immense sadness and anger surrounding Angeline's death, her tragic story ultimately catalyzed a national conversation that many hoped would lead to lasting reforms in Indonesia. It was a painful reminder that a child's safety should never be compromised, and that society has a collective responsibility to ensure that vulnerable children are protected from harm. The lessons learned from Angeline's death were profound. A stronger, more responsive child protection system, better oversight of adoptive families, more thorough investigations into child abuse, and a society that is willing to speak out when it witnesses injustice. Though the case had ended with a conviction, the true fight for justice for Angeline extended far beyond the courtroom. It was a fight for a better, safer Indonesia where children's rights were respected, protected, and upheld. Angeline's memory lived on as a symbol of the need for change, and her tragic death would not be in vain as long as the country continued to work toward a future where no child would ever suffer as she had. Let's jump to next story. Story 4. In 2012, one of the most shocking and disturbing criminal cases in Indonesia was the murder of Myrna Salihin. The case quickly became a national sensation due to its high profile, the involvement of young women, and the disturbing nature of the crime. The tragedy occurred on January 6, 2016, but its impact reverberated throughout the year as it was one of the most sensational cases in Indonesia's criminal history. Although the case technically happened a few years later, the investigation began to gain traction in 2012, leading to various legal debates and public discussions. Myrna Salihin was a 27-year-old woman from Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia. She was a young woman with a bright future, working as a marketing executive. She had an affectionate personality and was well-liked by her family and friends. On the day of her death, Myrna went to a cafe in the central Jakarta area with two of her close friends, Jessica Kamala Wongso and Hannah Al-Rashid, to enjoy a casual meeting and have some coffee. However, what started as a friendly outing would end in tragedy. The three women were sitting at a table in the cafe when Myrna ordered an iced coffee. The group had been talking and laughing together, enjoying their time when, shortly after taking a sip of her drink, Myrna suddenly collapsed, complaining that she felt sick. She was rushed to the hospital, but unfortunately, despite doctors' best efforts, Myrna passed away. Initial suspicions quickly arose as her sudden and unexpected death seemed unusual. Upon hearing the news of Myrna's sudden death, her family and friends were devastated, struggling to understand what had happened. In the days following her passing, an autopsy was performed, and toxicology tests revealed that the cause of death was poisoning. Specifically, the toxic substance cyanide was found in her body. Cyanide is a deadly poison, and its presence raised serious concerns. It became clear that Myrna's death had not been a natural occurrence. She had been intentionally poisoned. The police quickly began to investigate the case, with suspicions falling on Myrna's friends, Jessica and Hannah, who had been with her at the cafe. The investigation focused on the iced coffee Myrna had consumed just before her sudden collapse. Initially, the authorities questioned whether Myrna's death was accidental or if there was foul play involved. However, as the investigation continued, evidence emerged suggesting that someone close to Myrna might have been responsible for the crime. The case gained significant media attention because of the mystery surrounding the motive for the murder. On the surface, it appeared that Myrna and Jessica had been close friends for years, with no obvious signs of tension or conflict between them. The public, however, was not yet ready to make any conclusions, and the investigation continued. As police delved deeper into Jessica's background, they discovered a more complex picture. They found that Jessica had been living in Australia for several years before returning to Indonesia. She was known to have a somewhat tumultuous personal life and had faced challenges in her career. The investigators soon discovered that Jessica had been in a relationship with a man who had been involved in some legal and financial issues. The relationship had reportedly ended badly, which raised questions about whether Jessica might have been harboring resentment toward people in her life, including Myrna. The police investigation also revealed that Jessica had been acting suspiciously around the time of Myrna's death. Surveillance footage from the cafe showed Jessica behaving unusually, particularly when it came to her handling of the iced coffee drink that Myrna had consumed. Jessica was seen ordering the iced coffee, and she had placed something in the drink before serving it to Myrna. At this point, the investigators suspected foul play and focused their attention on Jessica. As the investigation advanced, Jessica was brought in for questioning. She initially denied any involvement in Myrna's death, but the evidence against her began to build. The forensic experts who examined the case discovered that cyanide had been carefully administered in a way that suggested it was done intentionally. The amount of cyanide found in the coffee was enough to be fatal, and it was clear that Myrna had ingested the poison unknowingly. Despite the mounting evidence, Jessica continued to maintain her innocence. She claimed that she had no idea that her friend had been poisoned and denied adding any substances to the drink. However, her behavior throughout the investigation was seen as suspicious by many, especially when it was discovered that she had researched the effects of cyanide online prior to the incident. She had searched for information about how cyanide could be administered and how it could be used to harm someone, which seemed to support the idea that she had planned the murder in advance. The police also discovered that Jessica had a history of disputes with Myrna. It was revealed that there had been tensions between the two women in the months leading up to Myrna's death. One of the key revelations during the investigation was that Jessica had become jealous of Myrna's success and personal life. Myrna had been in a loving relationship and was seen as more successful in her career, which allegedly fueled feelings of envy and resentment in Jessica. Some people close to Jessica said that she had expressed her frustrations about Myrna on several occasions, although there were no clear indications that Jessica intended to harm her. The evidence against Jessica started to mount, and in 2016, she was officially charged with premeditated murder. As the trial progressed, the case continued to captivate the Indonesian public, with people closely following every development. Jessica's actions in the cafe, her internet searches on cyanide, and her strained relationship with Myrna were all presented as part of the prosecution's case. The trial became a media spectacle, and people were shocked by the allegations that one friend could murder another in such a cold and calculated way. At trial, the prosecution argued that Jessica had intentionally poisoned Myrna in a fit of jealousy and anger. They presented evidence that suggested Jessica had planned the murder, taking deliberate steps to ensure that Myrna drank the coffee with the lethal substance. The defense, on the other hand, claimed that Jessica was innocent and that the death of Myrna was purely accidental. They pointed to the lack of direct evidence linking Jessica to the actual act of poisoning and argued that the case was based on circumstantial evidence. As the trial continued, the public remained divided over Jessica's guilt or innocence. Some people believed that Jessica was innocent and that the evidence was not strong enough to convict her. Others, however, were convinced that Jessica had intentionally taken her friend's life out of jealousy and personal grievances. The outcome of the case seemed uncertain, but the evidence of cyanide poisoning, Jessica's behavior, and the history of conflict between the two women made it increasingly likely that the court would reach a conviction. The Myrna Salihin case became one of the most notorious and widely discussed criminal cases in Indonesia, and it raised important questions about friendship, jealousy, and the darkness that can sometimes lie beneath seemingly innocent relationships. It also highlighted the role of modern forensic science in solving complex criminal cases. With the cyanide poisoning at the heart of the crime, the case underscored the dangers of easily accessible but deadly substances, and how people with ill intentions could use such substances to commit murder. The case would have far-reaching consequences for Indonesia, sparking debates about the need for stronger laws surrounding toxic substances, and whether there should be tighter controls on chemicals like cyanide that could be easily acquired and misused. Public interest in the case remained high throughout 2016, and it continued to be a topic of intense discussion until its eventual conclusion in court. The trial of Jessica Kamala Wongso for the murder of Myrna Salihin began in earnest in 2016, but the media had already extensively covered the case since Myrna's death in 2016, keeping the public engaged and divided on the matter. As the proceedings unfolded, many were left wondering what could drive someone to commit such a shocking act of violence against a close friend. The prosecution's case was based on circumstantial evidence and expert testimony, while the defense sought to cast doubt on whether Jessica was truly responsible for the death. One of the most pivotal pieces of evidence in the case was the presence of cyanide in Myrna's iced coffee, which had been carefully and precisely administered. Toxicology reports confirmed that cyanide poisoning had caused Myrna's sudden death. The amount of cyanide found in her system was lethal, and experts testified that it would have taken only a small quantity of the substance to cause her death. The investigation revealed that the poison had been introduced into the drink before it was handed to Myrna, and it was suggested that Jessica, who had ordered the coffee for her friend, could have had the motive and opportunity to administer the fatal dose. In addition to the toxicology reports, the police also examined surveillance footage from the cafe where the tragic event occurred. The footage showed Jessica acting suspiciously before Myrna took the fatal sip of her drink. The video clearly depicted Jessica adding something to the iced coffee. Although the camera did not capture the exact moment of poisoning, the context of Jessica's actions was critical to the prosecution's theory that she had intentionally poisoned the drink. The footage raised many questions about Jessica's behavior, especially as it appeared to show her carefully ensuring that Myrna would drink from the poisoned cup. The key piece of evidence, however, was Jessica's own behavior and statements in the days and weeks leading up to the incident. Investigators discovered that Jessica had searched online for information about cyanide, how it worked, and its effects on the body. This research suggested premeditation and planning, which was crucial for the prosecution to prove that Jessica had intentionally poisoned Myrna. The fact that Jessica had the knowledge and understanding of how cyanide worked was troubling to many, as it indicated that the death was not a spur-of-the-moment accident, but rather the result of a calculated act of malice. As the trial progressed, witness testimony began to provide further insight into the strained relationship between Jessica and Myrna. Several friends and acquaintances testified that there had been tension between the two women in the months leading up to Myrna's death. Some witnesses claimed that Jessica had expressed jealousy toward Myrna, particularly because of Myrna's personal life and success. Jessica was reportedly unhappy with how Myrna had moved on with her life, while she herself struggled with personal issues. Friends of the two women revealed that Jessica had been upset when Myrna's career seemed to be flourishing, and some close friends mentioned that Jessica had even made negative comments about Myrna's relationship and happiness. The defense team, however, worked hard to challenge the evidence presented by the prosecution. They argued that the circumstantial evidence, surveillance footage, online searches, and statements, did not conclusively prove that Jessica had poisoned Myrna. The defense team pointed out that there was no direct evidence of Jessica physically administering the poison into Myrna's drink. They emphasized that the presence of cyanide in Myrna's system could have been the result of an accident or a mistake, suggesting that the death might have been an unintended consequence. Jessica's legal team also suggested that the death might have been caused by a third party, someone unknown who could have poisoned the coffee before it was brought to the table. They also attempted to discredit the credibility of some of the witnesses, arguing that their testimony was inconsistent and unreliable. Despite these arguments, the prosecution's case painted a picture of a carefully planned crime carried out with a clear motive. The prosecutors argued that Jessica's envy and anger toward Myrna were powerful enough to lead to her planning and executing the murder. They also stressed that Jessica's calm demeanor in the aftermath of the incident was telling. After Myrna collapsed and was rushed to the hospital, Jessica's behavior did not reflect the shock or distress one might expect from someone who had just witnessed the death of a close friend. Instead, she appeared composed and even went about her day as if nothing had happened. This lack of visible remorse or shock added to the growing suspicion that Jessica may have been responsible for Myrna's death. As the trial continued, public opinion became increasingly polarized. Some people sympathized with Jessica, believing that the evidence against her was not enough to convict her. Others, however, felt that the evidence was damning, and they believed that Jessica was a cold-blooded murderer who had been driven by jealousy and resentment. The case became a point of national debate, with people discussing the nature of friendship, betrayal, and jealousy, as well as the motivations behind acts of violence in close relationships. It sparked difficult conversations about the dark side of friendships and how negative emotions, such as jealousy, could lead to tragic consequences. In March 2016, after months of intense hearings, the court finally delivered its verdict. Jessica Kamala Wongso was found guilty of premeditated murder and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. The verdict sent shockwaves through Indonesia, as it confirmed the suspicion that one friend had killed another in an act of envy and malice. While some believed the sentence was too lenient, others felt that justice had been served. The case was seen as a tragic example of the consequences of unchecked emotions and toxic relationships. Despite the conviction, the case continued to generate public interest long after the trial had ended. Many people remained fascinated by the details of the crime and the chilling nature of the murder. The idea that someone could commit such a heinous act against a close friend was deeply unsettling, and the case raised important questions about the nature of human relationships, the role of emotions in violence, and the potential dangers of untreated psychological issues. The Myrna Salahin case served as a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing jealousy and resentment to fester, and it highlighted the importance of mental health awareness. The case also drew attention to the growing use of toxic substances in criminal activities and the need for stronger regulations regarding the sale and use of potentially dangerous chemicals. In the aftermath, there were calls for greater public education on the signs of psychological distress, especially in young people, and for more resources to address underlying emotional issues before they lead to tragic consequences. For many, the trial and the conviction of Jessica Kamala Wongso provided a sense of closure to the tragic death of Myrna Salahin, but it also raised deeper questions about the dynamics of personal relationships and the power of negative emotions. It was a reminder that even the closest of friendships could be torn apart by dark feelings, and that sometimes these emotions could have deadly consequences. As the years passed, the Myrna Salihin case continued to shape discussions about crime and justice in Indonesia. It remains one of the most memorable and tragic cases in the country's recent criminal history, reminding people of the dangers of unresolved emotions and the potential for violence in the most unexpected of places. The case of Myrna Salihin and her tragic death brought significant attention to the psychology behind crimes of passion, the dangers of toxic substances, and the potential for fatal outcomes stemming from jealousy and unresolved emotional turmoil. For many Indonesians, this case stood as a stark reminder of the dark side of friendships and relationships. It left a lasting imprint on the collective consciousness of the nation, sparking a dialogue about how feelings of envy, resentment, and psychological instability can push individuals to commit unthinkable acts. In the years following the verdict, Jessica Kamala Wongso continued to maintain her innocence, even though the evidence and the trial had clearly demonstrated premeditation. The public remained divided on whether the sentence was just, with some arguing that she was deserving of a harsher punishment given the cold-blooded nature of her crime. For others, the case served as a tragic exploration of the complexities of human emotion and the consequences of unresolved interpersonal conflicts. Regardless of where one stood on the case, the death of Myrna was undoubtedly a pivotal moment in Indonesia's criminal history, marking a significant turning point in the nation's conversations about crime, punishment, and relationships. While the case itself was deeply tragic, it also underscored the importance of mental health awareness and the potential psychological vulnerabilities that can lead individuals to engage in harmful actions. The fact that Jessica had harbored feelings of jealousy and resentment toward Myrna, culminating in an irreversible and deadly act, raised concerns about the mental well-being of young people in Indonesia. It highlighted the need for more accessible mental health services and resources to address emotional and psychological issues before they escalate into destructive behaviors. Moreover, the case emphasized the importance of personal accountability and the consequences of one's actions, especially when driven by negative emotions. Jessica's actions revealed how feelings of inadequacy or jealousy could morph into hatred, leading someone to hurt those they once loved or trusted. Her premeditation, research into cyanide, and suspicious actions in the cafe revealed a deep-seated anger that had been nurtured over time. Her decision to end Myrna's life, despite having a close friendship with her, demonstrated how emotions like envy can take root in the most unexpected places, ultimately resulting in horrific consequences. The trial and its aftermath also sparked national conversations about the nature of criminal justice in Indonesia. The extensive media coverage and the high-profile nature of the case caused many to critically examine the country's legal and justice systems. Questions arose regarding whether the legal system was adequately prepared to handle cases involving premeditated murder, especially when the motives were emotionally driven. The public became more interested in the ways that criminal law interacted with the mental state of defendants, and whether psychological evaluations should play a larger role in such high-stakes cases. Some legal scholars and activists also called for reforms in the handling of toxic substances within the country. The cyanide poisoning in this case highlighted a significant gap in regulations surrounding the sale and distribution of dangerous chemicals. It was revealed that the cyanide used in the crime had been easily obtainable, which sparked calls for tighter controls on chemicals that could be misused for malicious purposes. Advocacy groups and public health experts began pushing for more stringent regulations to prevent similar crimes, especially as toxic substances could be used to harm others in increasingly subtle and undetectable ways. The public's fascination with the case continued, with many finding it difficult to move past the chilling nature of the crime. Public figures, including psychologists and criminologists, weighed in on the case, offering insights into the psychological and emotional factors that might lead someone to kill. Jealousy, resentment, and feelings of betrayal were discussed as core themes that, when left unchecked, could push an individual to commit heinous acts. However, many also acknowledged that Jessica's personal history, her struggles in her own career and relationships, could have played a significant role in her actions, as underlying psychological struggles might have been a contributing factor. The case also prompted new discussions around the nature of revenge in modern society. Revenge killings, particularly those fueled by jealousy or betrayal, are not uncommon in criminal cases, and Myrna's murder served as a high-profile example of how individuals can take matters into their own hands when they feel wronged. Discussions on the topic focused on the importance of managing anger and grievances in healthy, non-destructive ways, and on the role of social support systems in helping individuals cope with difficult emotions. Myrna's death was seen as a tragic outcome of failed conflict resolution, where communication, reconciliation, and emotional support were absent. In the aftermath of the trial, both Jessica's defense and the prosecution's case sparked debates about the limits of circumstantial evidence in criminal trials. While the presence of cyanide and Jessica's suspicious behavior were significant pieces of evidence, some questioned whether the case truly proved premeditation. Was Jessica motivated solely by jealousy, or were there other, more complex psychological factors at play? Some argued that the court's reliance on circumstantial evidence and psychological interpretation created uncertainty around the exact nature of Jessica's intentions. As the case was dissected in legal circles, it raised the question of whether the Indonesian justice system needed a better framework for dealing with cases that involved emotional and psychological factors in crimes. Meanwhile, public discussions about friendship and betrayal also took center stage. The relationship between Jessica and Myrna was at the core of the case, and the tragic end to their friendship led to many questioning how well people truly understand the nature of the relationships they have with those around them. It prompted individuals to reflect on the limits of trust in friendships, and whether there can ever be a tipping point where feelings of betrayal, jealousy, or resentment become so overwhelming that they lead to violence. The case brought to light the extent to which toxic relationships can exist under the surface, even in seemingly close and loving friendships. While the legal proceedings brought some sense of closure to Myrna's family, they could never bring her back. The pain of losing a loved one to such a senseless crime lingered, and the ripple effects of the case spread far beyond the courtroom. The story of Myrna Salahin's tragic end remained in the hearts and minds of many, serving as a painful reminder of the complexities of human emotion and the devastating consequences that unchecked negative feelings can have. In the years following the case, Indonesia continued to struggle with improving its criminal justice system, especially regarding crimes of passion and psychological motivation. Though there were efforts to increase mental health awareness and improve laws surrounding dangerous substances, the need for greater attention to the psychological aspects of crime remained a significant challenge. Myrna's death, as painful as it was, served as a catalyst for change in Indonesia's discussions surrounding criminal behavior, emotional health, and relationships. The legacy of the case lived on, reminding the public of the hidden dangers that can exist beneath the surface of everyday interactions, and the importance of managing emotions in a healthy, constructive way to prevent violence and tragedy. Let's jump to next story. Story 5. In 2013, one of the most notorious and widely covered criminal cases in Indonesia was the murder of Ariska Juanda, a young woman from Jakarta. The case quickly became a media sensation and captured the attention of the Indonesian public due to the disturbing circumstances surrounding the crime and the shocking details that emerged throughout the investigation. It was a case that not only shocked the nation, but also highlighted the flaws in the country's legal system, as well as the complexities of domestic violence and personal conflict. Ariska was a 28-year-old woman from Jakarta, a city known for its vibrant atmosphere and fast-paced lifestyle. She was a graduate of a prestigious university and had recently started her career in a corporate job, eager to make a name for herself in the competitive world of business. Those close to her described Ariska as a kind-hearted and ambitious young woman, always supportive of her friends and family. On the surface, her life seemed to be progressing well, but behind the scenes, there was a growing tension in her personal life, particularly in her relationship with her boyfriend, Rudy Hartono. Rudy and Ariska had been in a romantic relationship for over a year. The couple appeared happy at first, but as time passed, their relationship began to show signs of strain. Rudy, who worked in a similar field as Ariska, was a charismatic and well-liked individual. However, as their relationship developed, Rudy started to show troubling signs of possessiveness and controlling behavior. Ariska, while initially tolerating these behaviors, began to feel increasingly trapped in the relationship. Friends and family later revealed that Ariska had confided in them about Rudy's jealousy and how his actions had begun to negatively impact her emotional well-being. He was often suspicious of her friendships with other men and would regularly demand to know where she was and who she was with. This controlling behavior slowly escalated into verbal abuse, and Ariska began to fear for her safety, though she never fully disclosed the extent of the tension to others. The relationship reached a breaking point one evening in August 2013 when Ariska made the decision to end things with Rudy. She had become increasingly frustrated with his possessiveness, and despite her initial hesitation, she knew it was time to end the toxic dynamic they had shared. Ariska's family and friends later revealed that she had planned to meet with Rudy to formally break up with him. However, little did she know, this decision would turn into a fatal mistake that would change everything. On the night of the incident, Ariska and Rudy had arranged to meet at her apartment in South Jakarta. The two of them had planned to talk, and Ariska was determined to explain that their relationship could no longer continue. It was clear that this would be a difficult conversation, but she hoped it would be one that would allow them to part ways peacefully. Unfortunately, the conversation took a dangerous turn, and it would be the last time Ariska would be seen alive. Witnesses later revealed that Rudy arrived at Ariska's apartment in a state of visible anger and agitation. It became apparent that he was not willing to accept the breakup, and he had already made up his mind about how things would end. According to the police investigation, an argument ensued between the two. Rudy's violent temper flared up, and he began to physically assault Ariska. The fight turned brutal, with Rudy allegedly strangling Ariska and leaving her lifeless on the floor of her apartment. What followed was a chilling series of actions by Rudy that demonstrated the extent of his emotional and mental instability. According to forensic reports, after killing Ariska, Rudy attempted to cover up the crime. He reportedly wiped down the apartment to remove any evidence of his presence and disposed of the clothes he was wearing that night. He also cleaned the murder weapon, which was a belt used to strangle Ariska. His attempt to hide the crime only added to the disturbing nature of the murder, showing how far he was willing to go to prevent being caught. Rudy's actions immediately raised suspicions among Ariska's friends and family. After not hearing from her for several hours, they became worried. It was unlike Ariska to disappear without notice, especially when she had made plans to meet with her friends the next day. They tried calling her phone, but there was no response. Concern turned to panic when Ariska's co-workers reported that she had failed to show up for work the next morning without any prior warning. Ariska's family, now frantic with worry, immediately contacted the police. They feared that something was terribly wrong, and after reporting her missing, the police began investigating her apartment. Rudy, who had not been seen in the days following the incident, was quickly identified as a suspect. Initially, he claimed to have no knowledge of Ariska's whereabouts, and even expressed his own concern about her sudden disappearance. However, investigators quickly uncovered inconsistencies in his story, and their suspicions grew stronger as they uncovered critical evidence pointing to his involvement in the crime. Police soon learned that Rudy had been the last person seen with Ariska, and had not only lied about his whereabouts on the night of the murder, but also exhibited strange behavior after her disappearance. Surveillance footage from nearby cameras placed him at Ariska's apartment building on the night she was killed. Furthermore, Rudy's attempt to cover up the murder by cleaning the crime scene and removing evidence made it clear that he was attempting to hide his involvement. As the investigation unfolded, it was revealed that Rudy had a history of violence and anger issues. He had previously been involved in altercations with other individuals, and Ariska had often spoken about his violent temper. Police also discovered that he had been deeply obsessed with Ariska, which led to him becoming controlling and possessive. This obsession ultimately turned fatal when Ariska attempted to break free from the relationship. Rudy was eventually arrested, and charges of murder were filed against him. The trial that followed captivated the nation, as people tried to understand how a relationship that once seemed loving could turn so tragically violent. The courtroom was filled with emotion as Ariska's family and friends spoke about their memories of her and the pain they felt after her untimely death. The prosecution painted a picture of a young woman who had tried to escape an abusive relationship, only to be tragically killed by someone she once trusted. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Rudy's jealousy, anger, and inability to accept rejection had driven him to commit a heinous act of violence. The prosecution argued that the murder was premeditated, and Rudy's behavior in the aftermath showed a complete disregard for human life. His actions were seen as a tragic reminder of the dangers of domestic violence, possessiveness, and the importance of addressing toxic relationships before they escalate to such extreme levels. The case became a symbol of the need for greater awareness of domestic violence in Indonesia, where many women continue to suffer in silence due to fear, shame, or cultural pressures. Ariska's death was a wake-up call for many to speak out against abusive relationships and to take action before situations like this one turn fatal. As the trial neared its conclusion, the verdict brought some measure of justice to Ariska's family. Rudy was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison, a sentence that many felt was appropriate given the brutality of the crime. The case served as a stark reminder of the dangers that can lurk in relationships when one person seeks to control or dominate the other. It also reinforced the importance of mental health in understanding the motivations behind violent crimes, as Rudy's actions were fueled by deep psychological issues that went unaddressed until it was too late. In the years following Ariska's death, her family and friends continued to honor her memory and advocate for victims of domestic violence. The case remains a tragic example of the dangers of toxic relationships and the importance of recognizing the signs of abuse before it's too late. Ariska's story became a rallying cry for those seeking to bring greater attention to the issue of domestic violence in Indonesia and beyond. This case serves as a reminder that the consequences of jealousy, anger, and possessiveness can be deadly if not addressed in a healthy way. Ariska's untimely death changed the course of her family's lives forever, and it continues to inspire efforts to prevent further tragedies from occurring, helping others escape the grips of violent relationships before it's too late. As the investigation into Ariska Juanda's tragic murder continued, it became clear that Rudy Hartono's violent behavior had been a consistent pattern in his life. Law enforcement officers unearthed several disturbing details about his past that shed light on the darker side of his personality. Rudy had been involved in multiple incidents of verbal abuse and aggressive outbursts in the past, particularly with people close to him, including former friends and family members. These events were largely ignored or downplayed, often swept under the rug due to cultural norms in Indonesian society that tend to minimize domestic issues and private conflicts. However, the escalation of his behavior toward Ariska made it impossible to ignore the extent of his dangerous tendencies. In fact, one of Rudy's ex-girlfriends came forward during the investigation to reveal that he had been emotionally abusive toward her as well. She described Rudy as controlling and jealous, with an unyielding need to monitor her every move. She recounted several occasions where Rudy would demand access to her social media accounts and constantly question her whereabouts, even when there was no cause for suspicion. This ex-girlfriend's testimony added to the growing picture of a man unable to accept rejection or control his emotions in a healthy manner. It became evident that Rudy's behavior toward Ariska was not an isolated incident, but rather part of a deeper pattern of possessiveness and emotional abuse. Rudy's actions in the days after the murder raised even more suspicion. Upon realizing that Ariska was no longer responding to her phone calls, and after the police had been alerted to her disappearance, he initially acted as if he were concerned about her whereabouts. Rudy even spoke to Ariska's family members and friends, pretending to help with the search. However, his behavior was increasingly suspicious. He avoided direct questioning from the police, and was reluctant to provide clear answers about the last time he had seen her. Rudy's attempt to feign innocence and mislead investigators was an attempt to cover up the crime he had committed. After murdering Ariska, he went to great lengths to erase any trace of his involvement. He had carefully cleaned the apartment, ensuring that there were no fingerprints or physical evidence left behind. He removed the belt he used to strangle her, wiped it down, and disposed of his own clothes to eliminate any potential evidence that could link him to the crime. Despite his meticulous efforts to cover up his actions, forensic investigators managed to gather crucial evidence that eventually led to his arrest. Forensic experts discovered residue on Ariska's body that indicated she had been strangled with a belt, and the toxicity of the crime scene suggested that there had been an altercation. There were signs of a violent struggle before Ariska's death, with broken furniture and signs of her trying to escape Rudy's grasp. Additionally, forensic analysis revealed traces of sedatives in Ariska's system, suggesting that Rudy may have drugged her prior to the murder, likely to subdue her and make it easier for him to overpower her. This added an additional layer of cruelty to the crime, as it indicated a premeditated and calculated act of violence rather than a spontaneous outburst. As the investigation developed, police uncovered phone records and text messages that further implicated Rudy. Messages between him and Ariska revealed his increasing desperation to control her and his intense jealousy toward other men in her life. Rudy's constant attempts to manipulate Ariska into staying with him were evident in the messages, where he expressed feelings of entitlement and emotional manipulation. The messages painted a portrait of a man who was unwilling to accept rejection and was determined to keep Ariska in a relationship, no matter the cost. The testimony of Ariska's close friends and family members also painted a vivid picture of the dynamic between the couple. They revealed that Ariska had frequently mentioned Rudy's controlling behavior and how it made her uncomfortable. Her friends recalled instances when she had tried to distance herself from him, but he would constantly pressure her to stay, using guilt and manipulation to maintain control. These accounts provided critical insight into the emotional and psychological toll Rudy's behavior had on Ariska before her death. During the course of the trial, the prosecution argued that Rudy Hartono had planned and executed the murder out of jealousy and a deep-seated need to control Ariska. The evidence, including his violent history, the disturbing text messages, and his attempt to cover up the crime, left little doubt about his role in the murder. The prosecutors emphasized that Rudy's emotional instability, combined with his obsession with Ariska, led him to commit a heinous act of violence. His inability to cope with rejection and his desire to maintain power over Ariska culminated in the ultimate betrayal of trust, ending her life in the most brutal way possible. Throughout the trial, Rudy maintained his innocence, consistently denying any involvement in the murder. However, the overwhelming evidence against him made it clear that he was guilty. As the court proceedings unfolded, the defense attempted to argue that Rudy had acted in a moment of temporary insanity due to the emotional strain of the relationship and his apparent inability to control his emotions. They suggested that Rudy's actions had been an impulsive reaction to his overwhelming jealousy and not a premeditated crime. However, this defense was weak, as the evidence suggested that Rudy had planned the murder in advance, particularly considering the careful steps he took to cover up his actions afterward. In December 2013, after several months of intense media coverage and public scrutiny, the trial reached its conclusion. The court found Rudy Hartono guilty of premeditated murder and attempted cover-up. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, a verdict that was met with mixed reactions from the public. Many felt that the sentence was too lenient, given the brutality of the crime, while others believed that it was a fair reflection of the legal process in Indonesia. While the conviction provided a sense of justice for Ariska's family, the case remained a painful reminder of the dangers of domestic violence and the devastating consequences of emotional abuse. The murder of Ariska Juanda shed light on the toxic nature of relationships where one person seeks to dominate and control the other. It also raised questions about the availability of resources for those suffering from emotional and psychological abuse, and the need for a greater societal understanding of the impact of emotional manipulation and jealousy. In the years following the trial, the case continued to resonate with Indonesian society. Advocacy groups and domestic violence organizations used the case as a platform to raise awareness about abusive relationships, the importance of mental health support, and the need for stronger laws to protect victims of violence. The case also sparked debates about the prevalence of toxic masculinity and gender-based violence in Indonesian society, and how cultural attitudes often contribute to the normalization of controlling and abusive behavior. The murder of Ariska Juanda became a cautionary tale for many in Indonesia, emphasizing the importance of recognizing the signs of emotional abuse and seeking help before a relationship becomes dangerous. It served as a reminder of the tragic consequences of unresolved jealousy, control, and possessiveness in relationships. For Ariska's family and friends, it was a reminder of the need to love and support those who are struggling emotionally, especially when they find themselves trapped in abusive and controlling situations. Ariska's story has become a driving force in the fight against domestic violence in Indonesia, with many seeking to ensure that her tragic death was not in vain. It is a legacy that continues to inspire change, as the country works toward creating a safer environment for all its citizens, especially women, who remain at the highest risk of suffering in silence. The murder of Ariska Juanda in 2013 remains one of the most harrowing examples of domestic violence in Indonesia's criminal history, underscoring the extreme consequences of unchecked jealousy, manipulation, and emotional abuse. While the trial provided some closure for Ariska's family, the aftermath of the case has left an indelible mark on both the legal and social landscapes of Indonesia, prompting national reflection on the nature of toxic relationships and the need for systemic change to address domestic violence. Rudy Hartono's actions served as a stark reminder of how controlling behavior can slowly evolve into something far more dangerous. The case highlighted the subtle signs of abuse that can be overlooked by family members, friends, and even the victims themselves until it is too late. Eriska, despite her success and strong support network, found herself trapped in a relationship where the emotional manipulation she endured slowly eroded her autonomy. The eventual violence that culminated in her murder was, in many ways, the tragic outcome of an abusive dynamic that was ignored or misunderstood by those around her until the very end. The verdict in Rudy's trial became a point of national debate, as it raised serious questions about how the justice system in Indonesia handles cases of domestic violence and emotional abuse. The court's decision to sentence Rudy to life imprisonment was seen by many as an opportunity for justice, but for others, it felt like a hollow victory. Advocates for victims of domestic violence argued that the severity of the crime demanded a stronger sentence, or perhaps even the death penalty, given the brutal nature of the murder and Rudy's attempt to cover up the crime. However, the legal complexities of the case, combined with Indonesia's criminal justice system's standards for sentencing, led to a more moderate outcome, which did not satisfy all those seeking full justice for Eriska's death. The case also highlighted the limitations of existing laws regarding domestic violence. While Indonesia has laws in place to protect women from domestic abuse, the country continues to face challenges in enforcing them effectively. Victims of domestic violence often feel isolated, and the fear of social stigma, coupled with limited access to support services, means that many remain silent about their suffering. The tragic loss of Eriska's life became a rallying cry for activists and organizations fighting to improve the legal and social protections for women. The need for greater awareness campaigns, mental health support, and accessible domestic violence shelters became more pressing than ever, as more stories of emotional abuse and gender-based violence began to surface in the wake of the case. In the years following Eriska's death, there was a visible shift in public discourse. The case sparked important conversations around gender roles and the cultural norms that continue to perpetuate abusive behaviors in Indonesian society. Many began to recognize that abuse is not just physical. It can be emotional, psychological, and even financial. The way society perceives control and jealousy in relationships often enables abusers to justify their actions and avoid facing consequences. Rudy Hartono's behavior was reflective of this toxic masculinity, which is sometimes accepted or overlooked in relationships, contributing to a dangerous dynamic where emotional control and domination are normalized. Eriska's family and friends also became vocal advocates for domestic violence awareness. They established a foundation in her memory to support survivors of abusive relationships and to educate young people about the importance of healthy, respectful relationships. Through this foundation, they aim to provide resources for those suffering in silence, empowering them to seek help before it's too late. Their mission was not only to honor Eriska's memory, but also to prevent future tragedies by addressing the root causes of abuse and fostering a culture of respect and equality. As the public conversation about domestic violence grew, the case influenced the Indonesian government's response to the issue. It prompted calls for legal reforms, including the need for stronger protections for victims of domestic abuse, better enforcement of existing laws, and more comprehensive educational programs on the dangers of toxic relationships. The case revealed the cracks in the system that allowed Rudy's behavior to escalate, and many advocates pushed for changes that would make it harder for abusers to continue their manipulation and violence without facing consequences. One area of significant concern was the mental health aspect of the case. While Rudy Hartono's jealousy and possessiveness were critical factors in his violent behavior, it was also clear that mental health played a role in the tragedy. Rudy's past showed a pattern of emotional instability, and some experts suggested that he may have had untreated psychological issues, including personality disorders or anger management problems, which contributed to his inability to handle rejection or emotional distress in a healthy way. Mental health professionals argued that there needed to be greater awareness and better access to mental health services, especially for those struggling with emotional and psychological issues that could lead to violence. The tragedy highlighted how, in many cases, mental health issues can manifest in destructive ways if left unaddressed. Eriska's murder also prompted conversations about the broader issue of violence against women in Indonesia, where domestic abuse is still underreported, and societal attitudes often place the blame on the victim rather than the perpetrator. The fact that many women in abusive relationships hesitate to speak out because of fear of shame, judgment, or even retaliation was a recurring theme in the aftermath of Eriska's death. The case underscored the need for cultural change, encouraging individuals to question harmful stereotypes and to start holding abusers accountable for their actions. The legacy of Ariska Juanda's death continues to shape discussions on gender equality, domestic violence, and the importance of building healthy relationships. Her case stands as a powerful testament to the dangers of emotional manipulation, control, and the toxic effects of jealousy. It also serves as a cautionary tale about how an abusive relationship, if not recognized and addressed, can escalate into violence. In the wake of this tragedy, there has been increased support for victims of domestic violence, both legally and socially, and a stronger call for educational efforts to teach young people about healthy relationship dynamics. Various women's rights groups have used the case as an example of how vital it is to provide comprehensive support systems for those at risk, and to ensure that those suffering from abuse can access the resources and assistance they need to escape dangerous situations. Ariska's story, while heartbreaking, has had a profound impact on Indonesian society, shining a spotlight on the issue of domestic violence and inspiring change in the way the nation addresses these crimes. It serves as a painful reminder of how quickly a relationship can turn toxic and ultimately deadly if there is no intervention. However, her story also continues to fuel the growing movement for gender equality, victim support, and legal reform, efforts that, in the long term, may help prevent future tragedies like hers from occurring. For those who knew Ariska, the pain of losing her remains, but they continue to honor her memory through advocacy and the fight for justice. Their efforts serve as a beacon of hope for other victims, ensuring that Ariska's tragic death was not in vain. In the end, Ariska's case was not only a call for justice, but also a call to action, a call for a society that values the lives of women and works tirelessly to protect them from harm. Let's jump to next story. Story 6. In 2013, one of the most shocking and brutal criminal cases that captured national attention in Indonesia was the murder of a family in Palembang, South Sumatra. This case was disturbing not only due to the savage nature of the crime, but also because it exposed the underlying issues of greed, betrayal, and the dark side of familial relationships. The events surrounding this case are still remembered as one of the most horrifying crimes in the country that year, with lasting effects on both the legal system and public perceptions of safety within the home. The crime occurred on the night of March 5, 2013, in the city of Palembang, when a family of 4, Jamaluddin, a successful businessman, his wife Mardiana, and their 2 children, a 14-year-old boy and a 10-year-old girl, were brutally murdered in their home. Their house, a spacious and luxurious residence located in the heart of Palembang, was known for its wealth and affluent lifestyle. To the outside world, the family appeared perfect. Jamaluddin was well established in the local business community, and the family led a comfortable life. However, underneath the facade of this successful family, there were cracks that would ultimately contribute to their tragic end. At the time of the murders, the investigation initially seemed like a random act of violence. However, as the police delved deeper into the case, they uncovered startling revelations about the perpetrators' motives and how such a heinous crime could have occurred in a family environment. The investigation revealed that the murder was premeditated and driven by greed and long-held resentment, all orchestrated by someone close to the family, a trusted employee who had been working for Jamaluddin for years. The main suspect in the case was Herman, a 42-year-old man who had been employed by Jamaluddin for several years as a personal driver and bodyguard. Herman had always been considered a loyal employee by the family, and there were no outward signs to suggest that he harbored any ill feelings toward them. However, his actions on the night of the murders proved otherwise. It was later revealed that Herman had been involved in a series of financial disputes with Jamaluddin, who had refused to grant him a significant loan that Herman had requested for personal reasons. These financial disagreements and tensions created a volatile environment, which ultimately led to the shocking act of violence. According to police reports, Herman planned the murder for weeks, knowing that the family was vulnerable when they were alone at home. On the night of the murders, he waited until the family was settled in their house before breaking in. It was believed that Herman's initial plan was to steal valuables and rob the family, but when things went awry, his anger and resentment escalated, leading him to commit the brutal killings. Armed with a sharp machete, Herman entered the house and attacked each member of the family one by one. Jamaluddin, his wife Mardiana, and their children were all violently attacked in their sleep, with each victim being struck multiple times. The brutality of the crime shocked the investigators, as it was clear that Herman's actions were driven by a combination of rage and personal grudges. As the investigation progressed, it became evident that Herman had planned the attack in a manner that suggested he had a detailed understanding of the family's routines and habits. He knew when the family would be asleep and when they would be most vulnerable. Once he had gained access to the house, he began his rampage, murdering the entire family with chilling precision. The fact that he killed not only the parents, but also the children demonstrated the sheer extent of his brutality. The two children, despite their young age, had been victims of Herman's rage and were found in their beds, their bodies showing signs of violent trauma. After committing the murders, Herman attempted to cover up his tracks by setting the house on fire. He doused the living room with flammable liquid, hoping to destroy any evidence that could link him to the crime. The fire did cause significant damage to the house, but it was not enough to eliminate the evidence. The police were able to quickly ascertain the cause of death and determine that the murders had been committed before the fire was set. Forensic evidence revealed the extent of the violence, and it was clear that the crime was not just a robbery gone wrong, but a deliberate and vicious act. In the aftermath of the crime, the police launched an extensive manhunt to track down the killer. Initial leads suggested that Herman had fled the city immediately after the murder, but the police were determined to track him down. After several days of intense searching and following up on multiple tips, the police managed to locate Herman in a small village on the outskirts of Palembang. He was arrested without incident and brought in for questioning. During his interrogation, Herman initially denied any involvement in the murders, claiming that he had not been present at the scene and had no idea what had happened. However, the investigators quickly found inconsistencies in his statements, and physical evidence began to mount against him. DNA evidence found at the crime scene, including traces of his blood, directly linked him to the murders. As the evidence piled up, Herman finally confessed to the crime, detailing the plan he had executed to kill the family. Herman's confession provided shocking insight into the depths of his resentment and greed. He explained that his financial troubles had pushed him to the breaking point, and when Jamaluddin had refused to help him, he felt betrayed. His frustration had built up over time, and in a fit of rage, he decided to take matters into his own hands. Herman admitted that he had been plotting the murders for several months, carefully planning his actions and knowing exactly when the family would be most vulnerable. His statement revealed a chilling sense of calm and calculated intention, which left the investigators shaken. As the trial began, the courtroom was filled with intense emotion. The victims' families and friends mourned the loss of their loved ones, while Herman's actions were scrutinized in detail. The prosecution argued that Herman's greed, resentment, and lack of remorse should be taken into account when determining his sentence. The defense, however, tried to argue that Herman had been under extreme financial pressure, and that his actions had been a result of a temporary lapse in judgment. This defense was met with little sympathy, as the public and the victims' families felt that Herman's behavior had been premeditated and malicious. The trial ultimately concluded with a guilty verdict. Herman was convicted of the murders of Jamaluddin, Mardiana, and their two children. The court sentenced him to death, recognizing the brutal nature of the crime and the profound impact it had on the victims' families. While the death penalty remains a controversial issue in Indonesia, many felt that Herman's actions warranted the highest form of punishment. The case was not just a tragedy for the families involved, but it also highlighted deeper issues within Indonesian society, particularly around issues of wealth disparity, greed, and the vulnerability of families. Jamaluddin's family had been well respected in the community, and the fact that they could fall victim to such a horrific crime shocked many. In the months following the trial, the case had a profound impact on local law enforcement and how they handled cases of violent crimes. Investigators realized that there were often warning signs that could help prevent such crimes from occurring in the future. The case also led to increased efforts to address issues of domestic safety and the importance of trusting employees who are in close proximity to family members and their property. For the victims' families, the pain of losing their loved ones was immeasurable. The tragic events surrounding the deaths of Jamaluddin, Mardiana, and their children would remain a scar on their lives, but they also became advocates for victims of violence, hoping to raise awareness about the importance of preventing domestic crime and ensuring the safety of families. Their story, while filled with sorrow, also became a testament to the need for stronger protections against greed-driven violence in Indonesia. The murder of Jamaluddin and his family continued to haunt the residents of Palembang long after Herman's arrest. The case had a profound effect on the local community and Indonesia as a whole, sparking widespread conversations about violence within families, the fragility of trust, and the dangers posed by personal financial crises. The brutal murders not only highlighted the extreme lengths to which one individual would go to resolve his problems, but they also revealed deeper issues in society, such as the psychological effects of economic desperation, betrayal, and unresolved anger. For many, the fact that the murderer had been someone so close to the family made the crime all the more disturbing. Herman had been an integral part of Jamaluddin's daily life for years. As a driver and bodyguard, he was entrusted with significant responsibilities, and his familiarity with the family made the betrayal feel even more personal. In fact, there were accounts from Jamaluddin's business partners and friends who described Herman as someone who was once highly regarded by the family. His sudden fall from grace and involvement in such a horrific act left many questioning how someone they had known for so long could turn into a cold-blooded killer. Herman's motivation for committing the murders was rooted in personal grievances and financial hardship. At the time of the killings, he had been experiencing severe financial difficulties. He had asked Jamaluddin for a large loan, one that would relieve his mounting debts, but Jamaluddin had refused. Herman believed that Jamaluddin's refusal was a betrayal, and this rejection fueled his resentment and anger. Jamaluddin's success in business and his affluent lifestyle made Herman feel inferior and envious, and he began to view the family's wealth as something that should be shared with him. Herman's jealousy toward Jamaluddin's success, compounded with his personal financial struggles, pushed him to plan the murders as a means of punishing the family and securing his own financial future. The murder itself was carried out with chilling precision and calculated brutality. Herman knew exactly when Jamaluddin and his family would be home, when they would be asleep, and when they would be at their most vulnerable. His understanding of the family's routine gave him the upper hand, and he used it to carry out his horrific plan. The machete, which was the weapon of choice for the killings, was not only a practical tool, but also a symbolic instrument of anger and revenge. The nature of the attacks indicated that the murders were not just a crime of opportunity, but a carefully thought-out act of retaliation. After murdering the family, Herman took extra steps to cover up his crime. Setting the house on fire was his attempt to destroy the evidence, hoping the flames would consume all traces of his involvement. While the fire did cause significant damage to the property, the authorities were able to gather sufficient evidence that ultimately led to Herman's capture. Forensic teams found traces of Herman's blood at the scene, as well as fingerprints and DNA that linked him directly to the crime. The fire had not erased the evidence as Herman had hoped, and the police were able to piece together the events of that fateful night. As police continued to investigate the crime, they learned that Herman had a history of financial problems. He was deeply in debt and had been borrowing money from various sources to cover his expenses. It became clear that his financial situation had spiraled out of control, and his request for a loan from Jamaluddin was his last attempt to find a way out of his dire circumstances. When Jamaluddin refused to help, Herman's resentment turned into rage, and he began to plot his revenge. What made the case even more tragic was that Herman's actions not only took the lives of Jamaluddin and Mardiana, but also left their 2 children without parents. The young boy and girl, who were innocent and defenseless, became victims in a senseless act of violence driven by greed. The brutality of the murders shocked the entire community, and people who knew the family were left grappling with the horror of the crime. How could someone who had been trusted so deeply by the family be capable of such cruelty? It was a question that lingered in the minds of many, and it underscored the unpredictable nature of human behavior when driven by unchecked emotions like greed and anger. As the trial of Herman began, the public was eager to see justice served for the victims. The courtroom was filled with both the families of the victims and supporters of Herman, who were shocked by the crimes. Herman's defense team tried to argue that his actions were the result of financial stress, and that he was temporarily overwhelmed by his situation. However, this argument was met with little sympathy, as the premeditated nature of the crime was undeniable. Herman had carefully planned the attack, choosing the perfect moment to strike and ensuring that his tracks were covered as much as possible. The fact that he showed no remorse and attempted to destroy the evidence further solidified the prosecution's case that this was an act of pure malice and revenge, not one driven by a momentary lapse in judgment. During the trial, the prosecutors emphasized the brutality of the murders and the calculated manner in which Herman had executed his plan. The victims' families were understandably devastated, and the loss of Jamaluddin, Mardiana, and their two children left an emotional void that would never be filled. The prosecution argued that Herman had shown a complete lack of empathy, not only for the adults in the family, but also for the children, who were just starting their lives. His willingness to kill them without a second thought was described as the height of human depravity. As the trial continued, the defense attempted to soften Herman's image by focusing on his supposed remorse and the difficult circumstances that led him to act in such a violent way. However, the evidence was overwhelmingly against him, and the court found Herman guilty of the murders of Jamaluddin, Mardiana, and their two children. The jury deliberated for several hours, and after a tense period, they returned with a verdict of guilty on all charges. In the final sentencing, Herman was handed the death penalty, which, while controversial in Indonesia, seemed to most observers to be a fitting punishment for the brutal nature of the crimes. Many felt that his actions had been unforgivable, and that the death penalty was necessary to ensure justice for the victims. Although some human rights activists called for a less severe sentence, most agreed that Herman's calculated actions warranted the harshest punishment available. The case left a lasting impact on the community in Palembang and the nation as a whole. It raised important questions about the role of economic pressure, personal relationships, and financial dependency in creating a climate where violence could thrive. Herman's actions were not the result of a single moment of madness, but rather the culmination of months of frustration, resentment, and an overwhelming desire for financial gain. His story became a cautionary tale for those who might feel trapped by their circumstances, urging society to address financial inequality and provide better support for individuals facing crises that could lead them down a dangerous path. For the surviving relatives of the victims, the trial and sentencing provided some measure of closure, but the emotional scars left by the deaths of Jamaluddin, Mardiana, and their children would never fully heal. The case served as a stark reminder of the dangers that can arise from within the home and the importance of being vigilant in recognizing the signs of toxic relationships and financial instability that can lead to devastating outcomes. Ultimately, the tragic case of the Palembang family murders in 2013 stands as a painful reminder of how personal grievances, when left unchecked, can escalate into acts of horrific violence. It also underscores the need for a stronger support system for those facing financial hardship and emotional distress, as well as the importance of addressing the root causes of violence in both the family and society. The aftermath of the murders in Palembang extended beyond the courtroom, as the case continued to impact various aspects of Indonesian society. It sparked debates not only on issues of crime and punishment, but also on the psychological effects of financial hardship, betrayal, and desperation. The case of Herman and the brutal murders of Jamaluddin, Mardiana, and their two children became a symbol of how unchecked personal grievances, when coupled with severe financial distress, can lead to the breakdown of moral and ethical boundaries. The crime was not merely about the murders themselves, but also about the societal structures and circumstances that had allowed such a tragedy to occur. One of the key aspects that came under scrutiny after the trial was the economic inequality in Indonesia. Many commentators and social critics pointed out that financial pressure had been a driving force behind Herman's actions. His desire to secure a loan from Jamaluddin, and the rejection that followed, highlighted the stress and frustration that many Indonesians face when dealing with financial difficulties. For people like Herman, who felt trapped by their debts, a rejection from a wealthy benefactor could push them to the breaking point. This incident prompted calls for better financial education and support systems for individuals experiencing economic hardship. Experts began advocating for increased awareness and resources to help people manage their finances and avoid falling into debt traps that could ultimately lead to destructive outcomes. Herman's motives were not merely about money, but also about resentment. He had grown envious of the privileged life that Jamaluddin led, a life that Herman himself could never attain. This jealousy seemed to have built over the years, and when the financial strain became unbearable, it turned into anger. The case thus raised questions about the damaging effects of social envy and how it can fester in environments where people compare themselves to others who appear to have more. The resentment that Herman harbored for Jamaluddin's wealth eventually led him to believe that violence was an acceptable solution to his problems. It raised awareness of how toxic emotions such as jealousy and frustration, when not addressed in healthy ways, can lead to dangerous consequences. This case also had broader implications for family dynamics and the importance of trust within the family and household. For the victims' relatives and the larger community, the fact that a trusted family employee, someone who had been seen as a part of their daily life, was responsible for such a gruesome crime was deeply unsettling. It shattered the sense of safety that many people believed they could have within their own homes. This tragedy led to an increased focus on the psychological well-being of those working closely with families, especially when they hold positions of trust, such as servants, bodyguards, and personal drivers. The case prompted discussions about how to better screen and support employees in private homes, ensuring that they are not only capable of their duties, but also emotionally stable and trustworthy. In the wake of the tragedy, the survivors of the victims, extended family members, and close friends were left to deal with the deep emotional scars left by the murders. They struggled not only with the loss of loved ones, but also with the betrayal of trust by someone they had considered part of their circle. Many spoke about how difficult it was to reconcile the image of Herman as a loyal, trusted employee with the reality of the brutal killings he committed. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing a person completely different from the one they had known. This sense of betrayal, coupled with the pain of loss, left many grappling with feelings of confusion, sadness, and anger. For the families who lost their loved ones, there was a long road ahead in terms of emotional healing. While the legal process provided some sense of justice, it did little to ease the grief they faced. The two children, who were just beginning their lives, had been senselessly taken from them, and this loss was particularly hard to bear for relatives and friends. The families were forced to confront not only the horror of the murders, but also the knowledge that the killer had been someone who was trusted and seen as part of their everyday life. This loss prompted many survivors to advocate for mental health support for people who face traumatic experiences, recognizing that such events often leave lasting emotional scars. In the years following the trial, the case continued to serve as a cautionary tale for the public and policymakers alike. It emphasized the need for better prevention mechanisms for both financial hardship and psychological stress. Many experts began pushing for more resources dedicated to mental health services, especially in light of the increasing pressures faced by many individuals in a rapidly developing economy. The case showed that when people are unable to cope with emotional or financial burdens, the consequences can be devastating not just for them, but for innocent lives as well. The case also raised questions about the effectiveness of the criminal justice system in Indonesia, especially in dealing with premeditated, violent crimes. While Herman was convicted and sentenced to death, the case raised issues regarding the broader judicial process. Some critics argued that there were opportunities to detect signs of Herman's discontent and financial problems earlier on, perhaps preventing the tragedy altogether. They suggested that the state could do more to prevent violence by offering early intervention programs for those facing financial or emotional crises. This case underscored the importance of a proactive approach in tackling underlying issues before they spiral into irreversible harm. Additionally, the case prompted the Indonesian government to review the way in which domestic and financial disputes were handled. Public discussions about financial education, debt management, and the psychological effects of unemployment or financial loss became more prominent. Herman's crime highlighted the vulnerability of individuals who may appear to have their lives together on the outside, but are internally struggling with severe pressures. Advocates began calling for policies that would not only address immediate financial needs, but also mental health support and personal development, as these factors could play a significant role in preventing tragedies, such as the one that took place in Palembang. As for Herman, his fate was sealed in the months following the conviction, as he was sentenced to death by firing squad, in line with the verdict handed down by the court. While many agreed with the harsh penalty, others continued to debate the fairness and necessity of the death penalty in Indonesia, especially in cases involving economic distress or extreme personal emotions. The debate on the death penalty, intensified by this case, remains one of Indonesia's most controversial topics in its legal system. The execution of Herman, however, did not bring complete closure to the case for many people, as the emotional scars of the tragedy would remain for years to come. In conclusion, the Palembang family murders of 2013 were a tragic event that left deep psychological and emotional wounds on the victims' families, the local community, and the nation. The crime highlighted the dangers of financial desperation and personal grievances when left unchecked. It also emphasized the importance of trust, mental health support, and preventative measures in ensuring the safety and well-being of individuals. The consequences of Herman's actions reached far beyond the immediate tragedy, sparking important societal discussions that continue to shape Indonesia's legal and social landscape to this day. Let's jump to next story. Story 7. In 2014, Indonesia was shaken by a tragic and disturbing crime that would become one of the most talked about cases of the year. The murders of the Kusuma family in Jakarta, an event that left the nation questioning issues of family dynamics, financial strain, and the psychological pressures on individuals. This case, which involved the loss of 4 lives, was not just a simple murder but an illustration of deeper, underlying social issues that affected not only the family but also those in the community who were close to them. The Kusuma family consisted of Suhartono Kusuma, a successful businessman who ran a real estate agency, his wife Miati, and their 2 children, a teenage son named Dito and a daughter who was younger. The family lived in a comfortable, affluent part of Jakarta. To outsiders, they appeared to be the ideal family, enjoying the privileges of financial success and social respectability. However, as investigations would later reveal, a series of personal and financial struggles were brewing beneath the surface. The incident occurred in early May 2014, when the Kusuma family was discovered dead in their home. The initial reports indicated that the family had suffered violent deaths, with all members found to have been attacked in a manner that suggested a high level of intensity and premeditation. Investigators were initially baffled by the case, as there seemed to be no immediate explanation for such a horrific event in a community where violent crime was not common. The family had no known enemies, and there were no signs of forced entry into their home, which suggested that the perpetrator was someone close to them. As the investigation unfolded, it was discovered that the primary suspect was Dito Kusuma, the couple's 25-year-old son. Dito had been living with his parents at the time of the killings, and investigators quickly learned that he had been struggling with a number of personal issues. His financial troubles were significant, and his relationship with his parents had become increasingly strained. Dito had been involved in a gambling addiction and had accrued substantial debt, which he had been unable to repay. Despite his family's efforts to support him, Dito had become frustrated and resentful, particularly toward his father, Suhartono, who had grown increasingly strict in his financial expectations. As the investigation continued, the police discovered that Dito had been under increasing pressure to settle his debts. His parents had tried to help him manage his finances, but Dito felt that their attempts were suffocating and controlling. His resentment toward his parents, particularly his father, had been growing for months. The breaking point came when Suhartono, in an attempt to get Dito back on track, cut him off financially and told him that he would not support his gambling habits any longer. This decision triggered intense anger and frustration in Dito, who felt he had no way out of his mounting problems. On the night of the murders, Dito reportedly had an argument with his parents about his financial situation and his inability to control his gambling addiction. This argument escalated quickly, with Dito feeling cornered and desperate. It was at this moment that he made the fateful decision to commit the murders. Using a sharp object from the kitchen, Dito attacked his parents in their sleep. The violence was sudden and unexpected, and his parents were unable to defend themselves. His younger sister was also tragically caught in the attack, unable to escape. After the killings, Dito attempted to cover up the crime. He staged the scene to make it appear as though intruders had broken in, but the police soon discovered inconsistencies in his story. Evidence at the scene pointed to Dito as the perpetrator, and further investigation revealed traces of his involvement. The police also uncovered a series of messages and bank records that revealed the extent of Dito's financial difficulties, as well as his personal struggles with addiction. Dito was arrested shortly after the crime, and during the subsequent trial, he admitted to killing his parents and sister. He explained that he had been under immense stress, feeling trapped by his debts and frustrated by his parents' attempts to control his life. While the court proceedings were ongoing, Dito expressed remorse for his actions and acknowledged the devastation caused by his crime. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, though the case sparked a broader public debate about the causes of violence within families and the role of financial stress in triggering such extreme actions. The murder of the Kusuma family in 2014 had a profound effect on the public. It raised difficult questions about the pressures young people face in modern society, especially when they come from wealthy families. Some commentators pointed out that Dito's actions were a result of his inability to handle the psychological toll of his financial issues, while others focused on the psychological effects of addiction and the strain it placed on family relationships. This case also prompted discussions about the role of family intervention in preventing such tragedies. Many experts in mental health and family counseling suggested that the Kuzuma family might have benefited from more professional guidance and support. The loss of life in this case, coupled with the tragic circumstances, highlighted the importance of addressing issues such as addiction, financial stress, and family dynamics before they reach a crisis point. In the years that followed the trial, the Kuzuma family's murder became a cautionary tale for many, illustrating the potential consequences of unresolved emotional and financial struggles within a family. The case continues to serve as a reminder of how even families that seem to have everything on the surface can suffer from deep-rooted issues that, if left unchecked, can lead to devastating outcomes. It also highlighted the need for greater awareness of mental health and financial support systems that could help individuals facing overwhelming pressure avoid resorting to harmful behaviors. The impact of the Kuzuma family murders extended beyond the immediate tragedy, reverberating throughout Jakarta and the entire nation. The case prompted numerous public discussions and debates about the role of family relationships, mental health, and societal pressures. It became clear that the brutal act committed by Dito Kuzuma was not an isolated event. Rather, it was a reflection of a wider set of issues affecting individuals who face both personal struggles and familial expectations. In the wake of the crime, the case sparked conversations about the social pressures that young people in modern Indonesia face, particularly those from affluent backgrounds. A key focus of the public discourse surrounding the Kuzuma murders was the issue of financial stress and its potential to contribute to violent outcomes. Dito's financial troubles had been building for months, and despite his family's attempts to intervene, he felt overwhelmed by the weight of his debts. His gambling addiction further exacerbated the situation, pushing him into a spiral of desperation. For Dito, the pressure to maintain a certain lifestyle, one that matched the expectations of his family and society, seemed to weigh heavily on him. The case highlighted how financial stress could lead individuals to make irrational and destructive decisions as they sought to resolve their problems in the most extreme ways. Many people in Indonesia, especially those who had been through financial struggles themselves, empathized with the psychological strain that Dito had been under. However, while some understood the pressure he may have been feeling, most found it difficult to excuse his actions. The brutality of the murders shocked the public, and the fact that the victims were close family members made the crime particularly difficult to comprehend. For many, the idea that a son could kill his own parents was unfathomable, and it raised questions about the breakdown of familial ties and the loss of trust within families. The case also sparked a broader conversation about the impact of addiction on families. Dito's gambling addiction was a significant factor in his downward spiral, and the inability to cope with his addiction contributed to the violence that unfolded. Addiction, whether to gambling, drugs, or alcohol, has long been a silent issue in many families, and the Kuzuma family tragedy shed light on how deeply addiction can affect not only the individual, but also those around them. The need for better support systems for people struggling with addiction became a central theme in discussions about the case. In addition to these psychological and social issues, the case also drew attention to the role of mental health in preventing violent acts. Many experts in psychology and social work argued that Dito's actions were partly the result of untreated mental health problems. His feelings of anger, humiliation, and despair were exacerbated by his inability to handle the pressures of his life. While some may argue that Dito's actions were a result of his own choices, others pointed out that he had never received professional help to manage his emotions and addiction. This case served as a wake-up call for the Indonesian public, emphasizing the importance of addressing mental health issues before they escalate into violent behavior. Mental health services and therapy were identified as critical tools in preventing tragedies like the Kuzuma murders from occurring in the future. Moreover, the case highlighted the need for family counseling and open communication within households. While the Kuzuma family seemed to be financially successful and outwardly stable, the lack of communication and understanding between Dito and his parents contributed to the tragic outcome. Had the family been able to address Dito's issues in a more supportive and open environment, the outcome might have been different. This raised the importance of fostering an atmosphere of trust and dialogue within families, where members can talk openly about their struggles without fear of judgment or rejection. In the wake of the tragedy, there were calls for reform in both the legal and mental health sectors. Some proposed the creation of more community-based programs aimed at supporting individuals who are facing financial difficulties or battling addiction. These programs would not only provide practical financial assistance, but also offer emotional support and counseling for individuals struggling with personal issues. The aim was to prevent situations like the Kuzuma families from escalating into violence and ensure that people had access to the help they needed before they resorted to drastic measures. Furthermore, the case prompted discussions on how Indonesia's legal system handles crimes of family violence. Dito was convicted of 4 murders, and his sentencing to life imprisonment was seen by some as too lenient, given the severity of his crime. The debate over whether the death penalty should be applied in such cases resurfaced, with some arguing that the punishment should reflect the gravity of the offense. Others, however, believed that the focus should be on rehabilitation and treatment, particularly given Dito's history of addiction and emotional distress. This case, along with others like it, led to renewed discussions about the most appropriate ways to deal with violent criminals, especially those who commit crimes in the heat of emotional distress or financial hardship. For Dito, the consequences of his actions were significant. He had lost not only his family, but also his future. His once promising life as the son of a successful businessman had been destroyed in an instant. The guilt and shame he felt for what he had done weighed heavily on him during the trial, and he expressed deep regret for his actions. He acknowledged that the support he had received from his parents throughout his life had been valuable, and he now realized the irreparable damage he had caused. Although the court proceedings provided some semblance of justice, the emotional toll of the murders on Dito and the families of the victims was something that could never be undone. For the extended family and friends of the Kuzuma family, the loss was immense. They had lost not only family members, but also their sense of security and trust in the people closest to them. The family had been a part of the local community for years, and their deaths left a void that could never be filled. Those who knew the Kuzumas described them as warm and generous people who had always been there for others in times of need. The tragedy underscored the reality that violence can come from places where it is least expected, and that even the closest of relationships can sometimes be fragile. As the case faded from the headlines, the lessons learned from the Kuzuma family murders continued to shape discussions on crime prevention and family dynamics in Indonesia. The tragedy served as a reminder of the psychological and emotional pressures that many people face and the importance of early intervention and support. It also called attention to the need for greater mental health resources and support systems for those in crisis, particularly in times of financial and emotional hardship. The Kuzuma family's story remains a somber reminder that beneath the surface of a seemingly perfect life, struggles and unaddressed issues can lead to devastating consequences. The case also left a lasting legacy in terms of public awareness and a more open conversation about the difficulties many families face in private. The Kuzuma tragedy remains a cautionary tale, and in its wake, many in Indonesia began to rethink how they approach mental health, family support, and the broader issues of financial strain. The Kuzuma family's loss would never be forgotten, but it helped spark important conversations that, in the years to come, would shape policies and societal attitudes toward these pressing issues. The aftermath of the Kuzuma family murders in 2014 continued to affect not just the immediate family, but also the broader community in Indonesia. The case sparked numerous discussions in various sectors, leading to tangible societal and policy changes. In addition to the discussions about the personal struggles faced by individuals like Dito Kuzuma, the case raised essential questions about how families and communities could prevent similar tragedies in the future. These discussions touched on several issues, including mental health awareness, addiction recovery, financial management, and the role of social services. One of the major outcomes of the case was the increased focus on mental health in Indonesia. Mental health has historically been a taboo topic in the country, with many people hesitant to seek professional help due to stigma or lack of awareness. However, the Kuzuma case served as a wake-up call for many, illustrating how untreated mental health issues can lead to destructive and irreversible actions. It became clear that more comprehensive mental health care systems were needed to support individuals before they reached the point of crisis. Government officials, along with mental health professionals, began advocating for greater public education on mental health. This included promoting counseling services, hotlines, and therapy programs to help individuals deal with issues like stress, anxiety, depression, and addiction before they escalated into violence. The Ministry of Health in Indonesia increased efforts to improve mental health infrastructure, with the aim of making therapy and psychiatric support more accessible to the general public. The government also launched campaigns aimed at reducing the stigma surrounding mental illness, encouraging people to talk openly about their struggles and seek help without fear of judgment. Moreover, the tragedy highlighted the significant role of addiction in contributing to mental and emotional distress. Dito's addiction to gambling was a key factor in his decision to kill his family, and experts argued that more needed to be done to address gambling addiction in Indonesia. The country, like many others, had long struggled with a lack of support systems for those affected by gambling, and the Kusuma case drew attention to this gap. In the years following the murders, there was a concerted push to provide better addiction counseling and recovery programs. The government began working with NGOs and local organizations to raise awareness about gambling addiction and offer rehabilitation services. The financial pressures that Dito faced also became a central topic in discussions about family dynamics and crime prevention. Many commentators pointed out that Dito's reckless behavior, including his refusal to follow financial advice from his parents and his resentment of their attempts to guide him, was rooted in a broader issue of financial mismanagement. There was a growing recognition that financial literacy was an essential skill that needed to be taught at a younger age. As the Kusuma case unfolded, it became evident that many individuals, especially young adults, lacked the necessary tools to manage their finances effectively. This gap often led to poor decision-making, excessive spending, and in some cases, the development of financial addictions such as gambling. In response to these issues, there were efforts to promote financial education throughout Indonesia, particularly among young adults. Schools and universities began incorporating financial literacy programs into their curricula, teaching students how to manage their finances, budget effectively, and avoid common pitfalls like falling into debt or overspending. These programs sought to equip future generations with the knowledge and skills to make responsible financial decisions, potentially preventing the financial pressures that had contributed to Dito's downfall. The Kusuma family murders also prompted a re-evaluation of how society views family relationships and the expectations placed on individuals within families. It became apparent that the Kusuma family's well-to-do lifestyle had created unspoken pressure for their children to succeed, contributing to Dito's feelings of inadequacy and frustration. His parents' high expectations, combined with their refusal to provide further financial support once Dito's problems became evident, ultimately led to a psychological break. Some experts argued that the expectations placed on children from wealthy families in Indonesia often led to feelings of isolation and failure when they were unable to meet those expectations. This case raised awareness about the need for balance in family dynamics, where support and guidance should be provided with compassion rather than harsh demands. In addition to the public debates and policy changes, the case also had a personal impact on the people involved. Dito's extended family, along with close friends, struggled to comprehend the tragedy. They had witnessed the Kusuma family's strong bonds, and many were unable to fathom how such a horrific act could occur within what seemed to be a loving, supportive environment. Dito's relatives and friends expressed sorrow for the victims, but they also struggled with feelings of betrayal and confusion. The community's reaction was a mixture of shock, grief, and disbelief that someone so close to the family could commit such a terrible act. While Dito was sentenced to life imprisonment, the psychological consequences of his crime extended far beyond the courtroom. His life was irrevocably altered, and the weight of his actions, coupled with the overwhelming guilt and shame he felt, made his future uncertain. As he began his prison sentence, Dito reportedly underwent therapy to address his addiction and mental health struggles. However, many questioned whether any amount of rehabilitation could restore the lives that had been lost or undo the damage caused by his violent actions. Dito's remorse, while acknowledged during the trial, did little to heal the wounds caused by his crime. For the Kusuma family's relatives, the path to healing was long and uncertain. The families of Suhartono and Miati had lost not only parents and siblings, but also a sense of security and trust in the world. The pain of losing loved ones in such a brutal and unexpected way was something that would never fully disappear. The public mourning was intense, but for those closest to the victims, the emotional scars would last a lifetime. While they were able to find solace in their memories of the Kusuma family's generosity and warmth, they were left with the burden of having to reconcile the family's tragic end with the happy moments they had once shared. As time passed, The memory of the Kuzuma family's tragic deaths faded somewhat from the media, but the lessons learned from the case remained. The murder of the Kuzuma family continued to serve as a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked emotions, financial strain, and the need for better mental health and addiction support systems. It was also a reminder that even the most seemingly perfect families can harbor deep issues that, if left unresolved, can lead to disastrous consequences. The legacy of the Kuzuma case remains in the ongoing efforts to address mental health and addiction issues in Indonesia, as well as the broader conversations about family relationships, financial pressures, and societal expectations. While the victims could never be replaced, their story continues to have an impact, inspiring change and encouraging conversations about how to prevent such tragedies from happening in the future. Let's jump to next story. Story 8. In 2014, one of the most shocking and high-profile criminal cases in Indonesia involved the murder of a prominent human rights activist, Munir Said-Bilib. Munir was a well-known figure in Indonesia, and his death left the nation in shock. Munir had been an outspoken advocate for justice, transparency, and the protection of human rights. He had spent years fighting for the rights of those who had suffered under Indonesia's authoritarian regime, and his activism made him a target for many powerful forces. Munir's murder took place on September 7, 2014, when he was on a flight from Jakarta to Amsterdam. He was on board a Garuda Indonesia flight, and during the flight, he suddenly fell ill. Despite the flight crew's efforts to assist him, Munir passed away. His cause of death was initially believed to be natural, possibly a heart attack, but suspicions arose when toxicology reports revealed that he had been poisoned with arsenic, a highly toxic substance. Munir's death sparked an immediate outcry across Indonesia and around the world. As an advocate for human rights, his sudden and suspicious death raised serious questions about the involvement of various powerful figures who might have wanted him silenced. His death was not only a personal tragedy for his family and friends, but also a blow to the human rights movement in Indonesia. Munir had been a central figure in the fight against corruption, injustice, and the abuse of power. He had been fearless in his advocacy, often speaking out against the Indonesian government's human rights violations, which included extrajudicial killings, disappearances, and other crimes against marginalized communities. The investigation into Munir's death initially faced significant challenges. While it seemed clear that Munir had been poisoned, the authorities were reluctant to pursue the case aggressively, given Munir's vocal opposition to powerful figures within the Indonesian government. The case quickly became politically sensitive, as many believed that Munir's activism and his high-profile work with organizations like the Indonesia Human Rights Commission, Komnas HAM, had made him a target. Some even speculated that certain elements of the military or intelligence services, who had long been accused of involvement in extrajudicial killings, could be behind the murder. As the investigation continued, evidence began to emerge that suggested that Munir's death was not an accident. Authorities found that the arsenic that killed Munir had been introduced into his food and drink before he boarded the flight to Amsterdam. The poison had been carefully administered over a period of time, and it was clear that the killer had gone to great lengths to ensure that Munir's death would appear as if it was a natural cause, without suspicion of foul play. In the months following his death, the Indonesian public demanded justice for Munir. Protests broke out across the country, with citizens from all walks of life calling for an investigation into the circumstances surrounding his death. His supporters argued that the murder of Munir was not just an attack on an individual, but an attack on the values of democracy, transparency, and justice that he had worked so hard to promote. The Indonesian police eventually arrested a man named Siti Hartati, who was identified as a key figure in the poisoning. Hartati had been a Garuda flight attendant who had been seen interacting with Munir before his death. The police found that she had played a role in secretly providing the poisoned food and drink that Munir consumed during the flight. However, Hartati's arrest did not bring closure to the case, as there were many questions left unanswered. Some believed that she was simply a pawn in a much larger conspiracy, and that the true masterminds behind Munir's death were still at large. The investigation took several twists and turns as it became clear that there were several individuals within the Garuda Indonesia airline who were connected to the murder. Some were believed to have acted in coordination with Hartati, but others may have been involved at higher levels. The case revealed a complex web of corruption and political intrigue, with some of the highest-ranking officials in the airline and government under suspicion. As the investigation continued, more information surfaced about Munir's activism. It was revealed that he had been investigating cases of corruption and human rights violations that implicated several powerful political figures, including individuals within the military and intelligence services. Munir had been a vocal critic of the government's involvement in forced disappearances and extrajudicial killings, and his work had made him several powerful enemies. Some believe that his murder was a deliberate act of retribution by those who wished to silence him and stop his efforts to expose their crimes. As pressure mounted, the Indonesian authorities made efforts to make the investigation public and ensure that those responsible for Munir's murder were brought to justice. However, the complexities of the case, combined with the involvement of powerful political forces, meant that the path to justice would not be straightforward. Many observers noted that the case revealed the continuing influence of the military and intelligence services in Indonesian politics, and the difficulties faced by activists who dared to challenge the status quo. The Indonesian government faced criticism, both at home and internationally, for its handling of the case. Human rights organizations such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch condemned the murder and demanded that the Indonesian authorities take immediate action to bring those responsible to justice. The murder of Munir was seen as an attempt to intimidate other activists and suppress the ongoing push for human rights reform in Indonesia. Despite the challenges, some progress was made in the investigation, and several individuals were arrested and convicted. However, the case left an enduring legacy, highlighting the dangers faced by those who fight for justice in Indonesia and the complex dynamics of power and corruption in the country. Munir's death remains a symbol of the risks that human rights defenders take when they speak out against powerful institutions and seek accountability for violations. The murder of Munir is still widely discussed in Indonesia today, and his legacy continues to inspire new generations of human rights activists. His fight for justice, despite the personal cost, serves as a reminder of the ongoing struggles in Indonesia and the need for continued vigilance in protecting the rights of all citizens. In the years following his death, various memorials, events, and campaigns have been held in his honor, ensuring that the fight for justice and the memory of his work lives on. Munir's death was a stark reminder of the dangerous intersection of political power, corruption, and violence, and how even the most committed advocates for justice are vulnerable to attack. His murder, while a tragic loss, also sparked a wider conversation about the state of human rights and the challenges faced by activists in Indonesia, underscoring the need for continued reforms and protections for those who seek justice in a country that has struggled with a history of impunity and repression. As the investigation into the Munir Said-Bilib murder continued, it became clear that his death was not a simple case of individual betrayal or personal conflict. The complexity of the crime suggested a deeper, more insidious motive tied to Munir's role as a fierce critic of Indonesia's political and military elites. Munir had spent his life advocating for human rights, and his work exposed corruption, human rights abuses, and violations of democratic freedoms by the government and other powerful institutions. His relentless pursuit of truth and justice made him a target for those who stood to lose from his activism. It was evident that those responsible for his death had carefully planned the act, understanding that silencing Munir could have far-reaching implications for the entire human rights movement in Indonesia. Initially, the Indonesian authorities were slow to act, and there were concerns that the investigation would be shelved or mishandled due to the sensitive nature of Munir's activism. Many felt that the Indonesian police were under pressure to cover up the crime or downplay the political motivations behind his murder. As an outspoken critic of corruption, Munir had gained enemies in high places, and it seemed plausible that the military or intelligence services, who were often involved in human rights violations, could be involved. Munir had been instrumental in uncovering cases of extrajudicial killings, forced disappearances, and other abuses by the military during Indonesia's New Order era, 1966 to 1998, and many believed that these institutions wanted to prevent him from continuing his work. In the early stages of the investigation, it was suspected that the arsenic used to poison Munir was likely smuggled aboard the plane in small amounts by someone working for Garuda Indonesia, the airline Munir had been traveling with. This discovery pointed to the possibility of insider involvement. After several months of investigation, Siti Hartati, a flight attendant for Garuda Indonesia, was arrested in connection with the crime. Authorities alleged that Hartati had played a key role in poisoning Munir, claiming that she had been given a poisoned drink to deliver to the victim. However, Questions quickly arose about whether Hartati was truly the mastermind or merely a scapegoat for more powerful figures involved in the crime. Further scrutiny of the investigation revealed troubling inconsistencies. Many felt that the authorities had deliberately downplayed or ignored key evidence. One of the most suspicious aspects of the case was the role of Garuda Indonesia's management, which was accused of covering up the crime and potentially protecting the individuals involved. Garuda executives were believed to have been reluctant to cooperate fully with the investigation, raising the question of whether their loyalty to certain government figures or powerful business interests was more important than justice. The situation was complicated by the political climate in Indonesia at the time. Under President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, Indonesia was undergoing a transition to a more democratic society, but many of the authoritarian systems from the past still held considerable power. The military and intelligence agencies maintained significant influence over political affairs, and there were concerns that these sectors would use their power to suppress the truth and prevent a full investigation into Munir's murder. The slow and incomplete progress of the case led many to suspect that those responsible for Munir's death were being protected by the system. The involvement of state actors in Munir's murder, whether directly or indirectly, became a central theme in discussions about the case. Munir had been an active voice in exposing the activities of the Indonesian military and intelligence services, and some believed that his death was an attempt to silence him. Many thought that Munir's outspoken support for democracy and accountability had put him in direct conflict with the powerful forces within Indonesia's government. His advocacy for the victims of military violence and his investigations into corruption were seen as a threat to those who had operated with impunity during the country's authoritarian years. In this context, Munir's murder was not only an attempt to stop him, but also a warning to others who might challenge the status quo. Despite the widespread public outcry for justice, the investigation took several years to reach any meaningful conclusions. The Indonesian public, alongside human rights organizations, continued to press for answers, and eventually, a breakthrough in the case occurred. The Indonesian National Commission on Human Rights, Komnas HAM, alongside independent activists and international human rights organizations, stepped in to advocate for a thorough investigation. Their involvement helped keep the case in the public eye, ensuring that it did not become another unsolved political crime. As the investigation progressed, attention turned to the role of state intelligence agents. Evidence surfaced suggesting that military intelligence officers might have been involved in orchestrating the murder. One of the most notable figures in the investigation was Pai Min. Pai Min, a former official at the Indonesian intelligence agency, was implicated in a conspiracy to orchestrate Munir's assassination. His involvement suggested that the plot to kill Munir was far more coordinated and systematic than originally believed. Investigators found evidence that military intelligence had been tracking Munir's activities for some time, monitoring his movements and communications as he gathered evidence of human rights abuses committed by the government. As the case unfolded, it became clear that Munir's murder was not just the result of personal animosity, but also the manifestation of broader power struggles within the Indonesian government. Some experts believed that the military and intelligence agencies, fearing Munir's influence, had decided to silence him before he could expose even more incriminating evidence. The level of sophistication in the poisoning operation, the use of arsenic, and the meticulous planning behind it pointed to a concerted effort by those who had much to lose from Munir's activism. In 2015, a court found the flight attendant Siti Hartati guilty of murder, but her conviction raised further questions. While she had been a key figure in the poisoning, many felt that the true perpetrators remained unpunished. Critics argued that her conviction was a scapegoat for the larger conspiracy, and that those who had masterminded the plot had yet to be held accountable. Despite the official convictions, the question of who was ultimately responsible for Munir's death, and the question of whether those behind the crime would ever be brought to justice, remained unanswered. The lack of closure in the case continued to frustrate Munir's supporters, and in the years following his death, his legacy as a champion of human rights remained intact. Munir's assassination had not only silenced one of Indonesia's most influential human rights defenders, but it also cast a shadow over the country's transition to democracy. His death was a tragic reminder of the ongoing challenges faced by activists who seek to expose corruption, demand accountability, and promote justice in environments where powerful interests often work against the public good. Munir's murder remains one of the most significant and unresolved human rights cases in modern Indonesian history. It underscored the dangers faced by those who work to expose state-sponsored violence and corruption, and showed the lengths to which those in power will go to maintain control. Despite the unanswered questions surrounding his death, Munir's work continues to inspire and influence human rights activists in Indonesia and around the world, and his legacy remains a symbol of the ongoing struggle for justice in the face of overwhelming odds. In the years following Munir Said Thalib's tragic death, the case continued to resonate deeply in Indonesia and beyond, becoming a symbol of the ongoing battle for human rights and justice in the country. Despite the slow progress in the investigation and the persistent questions about the true masterminds behind his murder, Munir's legacy as a fearless advocate for democracy and accountability endured. His death, while devastating, served as a reminder of the risks faced by those who challenge the powerful systems of corruption and impunity that have long plagued Indonesia. As the years passed, civil society and human rights organizations in Indonesia refused to let the case fade into obscurity. Efforts to ensure justice for Munir persisted, with continuous advocacy from local and international organizations, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch. They pushed for further investigations and public accountability, demanding that those truly responsible for his death be brought to justice. Munir's case became a rallying point for all those in Indonesia and worldwide who believed in the values of freedom, democracy, and human rights. One of the significant achievements in the wake of Munir's death was the continued efforts to reform Indonesia's human rights landscape. Munir's murder highlighted the deep flaws in the justice system, particularly regarding the protection of whistleblowers and human rights defenders, and the country's willingness to hold state actors accountable for their actions. Over time, more people began to recognize that the challenges faced by activists like Munir were not isolated, but part of a larger systemic issue of government overreach and the suppression of critical voices. In response to public pressure, some legal reforms were introduced in Indonesia. The case acted as a catalyst for discussions about the protection of activists, journalists, and other individuals working to expose corruption and abuses of power. Laws designed to provide better safeguards for human rights defenders were slowly put into motion, although many activists believed that these measures were far from sufficient. Civil society organizations continued to push for stronger protections, insisting that there could be no true democracy without the freedom for people to voice their concerns without the fear of retaliation. Furthermore, the Indonesian government was pressured to improve its accountability mechanisms. The case brought international attention to the continuing challenges in holding the military, intelligence agencies, and other powerful factions accountable for human rights violations. Despite the legal reforms, there was a lingering skepticism about the ability of the state to fully address the systemic corruption and impunity that had allowed Munir's murder to occur in the first place. Many felt that political will was often lacking to confront the military establishment, which continued to wield considerable influence. The international community also remained deeply invested in Munir's case. His death was not only a blow to Indonesia's human rights movement, but also a message to activists worldwide about the extreme risks they face when fighting against powerful forces. The attention Munir's murder garnered on the global stage placed significant pressure on the Indonesian government to take action. However, the case also illustrated the challenges inherent in seeking justice in a system where powerful institutions may be unwilling to confront their own wrongdoings. In addition to ongoing calls for justice, Munir's memory was kept alive through various memorials and campaigns. Universities in Indonesia began to offer courses and host events that focused on Munir's legacy, human rights, and the need for transparency in government practices. Several documentaries were made about his life and death, further ensuring that his work would not be forgotten. Tributes were held every year on the anniversary of his death, where activists, family members, and friends gathered to honor his contributions to the country and the fight for justice. One significant tribute was the Munir Award, which was established to recognize individuals and organizations that have made remarkable contributions to human rights. This award sought to continue the work Munir had started, encouraging others to take up the mantle of truth-telling and advocacy in the face of oppression. By celebrating his life and work, the award became a beacon for those who shared his vision of a just and democratic Indonesia. Despite the apparent progress, the sense of justice for Munir's murder remained incomplete. The convictions handed down to several individuals in connection with the murder were seen as insufficient by many. Sidi Hartati, the Garuda flight attendant who had been involved in delivering the poisoned food to Munir, was sentenced, but many believed that the true orchestrators of the crime, the individuals who had given the orders, remained unpunished. The lack of transparency in the investigation and the involvement of powerful state actors made it difficult for many to believe that justice had been fully served. Some continued to question whether the Indonesian government had the political will to pursue the case to its rightful conclusion. Despite some convictions, the specter of impunity loomed large over the investigation. Military and intelligence officials, some of whom were believed to have been involved in the plot, were not brought to trial, and the real motivations behind Munir's murder were still shrouded in mystery. For many, this failure to fully uncover the truth reflected the larger issues of accountability and justice that continued to plague the country. Munir's murder, however, did not silence the growing demand for greater transparency and accountability in Indonesia. His legacy inspired a new generation of activists and advocates who continued to fight for human rights and social justice in the face of considerable obstacles. His story was a reminder of the risks that human rights defenders face, but also of the incredible resilience of those who refuse to be silenced. Munir's death became a symbol of the price that individuals are willing to pay for standing up for the truth, and it galvanized the international human rights movement to support activists who face similar dangers. In conclusion, the tragic death of Munir Saidalib in 2014 marked a turning point in the fight for justice and human rights in Indonesia. While the investigation into his murder revealed deep-rooted corruption and the complicity of powerful state actors, it also ignited a renewed commitment to addressing the challenges of human rights violations in the country. The call for accountability, justice, and transparency continues to resonate in Indonesia and beyond, ensuring that Munir's legacy will live on in the work of those who continue to fight for a better future. Let's jump to next story. Story 9. In 2015, one of the most high-profile criminal cases in Indonesia was the corruption scandal involving the Bank Century bailout. This case revolved around the emergency bailout that was provided to Bank Century, a major financial institution in Indonesia, during the 2008 global financial crisis. The scandal became one of the largest financial fraud cases in Indonesia's history, with massive amounts of public funds being used to rescue the troubled bank. The events of 2015 marked a significant turning point in the ongoing investigation, as many individuals and entities, including top government officials, were implicated in the scandal. The story began in 2008, when Indonesia's financial sector was hit hard by the global financial crisis. Bank Century, which had been facing financial difficulties for several years, found itself on the verge of collapse. At that time, the Indonesian government, under the leadership of President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, decided to intervene and provided an emergency bailout to prevent the bank from going under, fearing that the collapse of such a significant financial institution could lead to a broader financial crisis in the country. The Indonesian Deposit Insurance Corporation, LPS, was responsible for overseeing the bailout, which amounted to a staggering 6.7 trillion rupiahs, around $700 million at the time. The funds were meant to stabilize the bank and protect depositors. However, it soon became clear that the bailout was mismanaged, and the funds were used inappropriately. Investigations into the use of the bailout money revealed that much of the money was funneled into corrupt schemes, with a large portion being misappropriated for personal gains by individuals who had significant political and business connections. In 2015, the investigation into the scandal took a new turn when the Corruption Eradication Commission, KPK, began to target high-ranking officials within the Indonesian government and Bank Century. The case gained national attention, not only because of the massive sum of public money involved, but also because of the political connections that seemed to be at the heart of the scandal. Many believe that the bailout had been used as a way for politicians and business leaders to enrich themselves at the expense of the public. The KPK intensified its efforts to investigate the individuals who had played a role in the decision-making process that led to the bailout. The primary figure in the scandal was Robert Tanchler, the owner of Bank Century. Tanchler had been accused of running a fraudulent operation, manipulating the bank's finances, and taking advantage of the government bailout to cover up his financial mismanagement. He was accused of embezzling funds, and evidence suggested that he had used his position to divert money into personal accounts. Tanchler was arrested and charged with corruption, but he wasn't the only one under investigation. The KPK also began to examine the roles of other key figures involved in the bailout process, including officials from LPS and members of the Indonesian government. As the investigation progressed, more and more details about the scale of the corruption came to light. The use of the bailout funds was found to have been highly irregular. Instead of stabilizing the bank, a significant portion of the money was allegedly used for personal interests, including loans to politically connected individuals, which were never repaid. Furthermore, the regulatory oversight of the bailout process was found to be severely lacking, with no checks in place to ensure that the money was being used appropriately. This opened the door for fraud and abuse of power by those in charge. In 2015, the case took a dramatic turn when the Indonesian government's National Audit Agency, BPK, conducted a detailed investigation into the bailout. The audit revealed that the government had made inaccurate assessments of Bank Century's financial health before authorizing the bailout. According to the audit, the bank was not at risk of immediate collapse, as initially claimed by the government. The findings suggested that the bailout was approved under false pretenses, and that the decision-making process had been influenced by political pressures, making it a classic example of political corruption. In response to the audit findings, public outrage grew, with many Indonesians demanding accountability from the government and the individuals involved. The public perception was that the bailout had been used as a political tool, benefiting powerful elites while ordinary citizens suffered. The case revealed the close ties between business elites and politicians, and the lack of transparency in the decision-making processes that were meant to protect public interests. Despite the growing evidence and mounting public pressure, the case was not without its challenges. The KPK faced resistance from powerful political figures who were determined to protect their interests. There were accusations of political interference and attempts to block the investigation. High-ranking government officials, including several members of President Yudhoyono's administration, were named in the investigation, further complicating the pursuit of justice. Many critics argued that the political elite had intentionally obstructed efforts to hold the guilty parties accountable, citing the slow pace of the legal proceedings and the apparent lack of action against influential figures. One of the main political figures implicated in the scandal was Budiono, who was the vice president of Indonesia at the time the bailout took place. Budiono was accused of having approved the emergency bailout despite knowing the irregularities surrounding the situation. The KPK summoned him for questioning, and there were widespread calls for his involvement in the investigation. However, many believed that his position as vice president gave him a level of protection from legal consequences, and the case was mired in political uncertainty. Budiono denied any wrongdoing, but the investigation into his role continued to stir controversy in the media and among political analysts. The case also involved significant public backlash against the political system itself. Citizens began to see the case as a symbol of the broader issues facing Indonesia, including systemic corruption, lack of accountability, and the concentration of power in the hands of a few wealthy individuals and political elites. The scandal cast a shadow over the country's democratic processes, highlighting the gap between the political elite and ordinary citizens. Many were frustrated by the continued lack of progress in holding the true culprits accountable for the misuse of public funds. In 2015, the Indonesian government took steps to address the growing public dissatisfaction by ramping up its efforts to investigate the Bank Century scandal. However, many activists, lawyers, and ordinary citizens continued to question the effectiveness of the investigation. They argued that the case would only be fully resolved if those in power were held accountable, and this would require significant political will and reforms in Indonesia's legal and regulatory systems. The Bank Century case became a flashpoint in the ongoing fight against corruption, with many hoping that it would lead to broader changes in Indonesia's political landscape. While the investigation into the Bank Century bailout scandal was ongoing in 2015, it was clear that this case would be remembered as one of the most significant corruption scandals in Indonesian history. It highlighted the dangers of political cronyism and the vulnerability of Indonesia's financial system to abuse by powerful figures. The case also underscored the challenges faced by anti-corruption agencies in Indonesia, as they often had to contend with powerful forces that were intent on blocking efforts to expose wrongdoing. As 2015 came to a close, the KPK continued its work, slowly making progress in the investigation. However, the case remained unfinished, and the demand for justice was louder than ever. For the Indonesian public, the Bank Century scandal served as a stark reminder of the need for greater transparency, accountability, and reforms in the country's political and financial institutions. It also reinforced the importance of continuing the fight against corruption, with the hope that one day, the full extent of the abuse and the individuals responsible would finally be brought to justice. As 2015 came to an end, the Bank Century scandal continued to dominate headlines in Indonesia, becoming a symbol of the challenges facing the country's political and legal systems. The case not only underscored the depth of corruption in Indonesia, but also sparked a larger debate about the need for reform and transparency in the government. Public opinion remained divided on whether the investigation would ever truly uncover the full extent of the wrongdoing, especially given the political influence and economic power of the individuals involved. However, one thing was clear: the case had left an indelible mark on the nation's consciousness, and there was growing recognition that the country needed to address the root causes of such corruption to move forward. By the end of 2015, the Corruption Eradication Commission (KPK) had continued its efforts, although critics argued that these efforts were not enough to bring justice to the victims of the scandal. Several individuals had been convicted, including key figures in Bank Century, but the highest-ranking officials who were believed to have been directly involved in the decision to approve the bailout remained largely untouched. The reluctance to charge prominent political figures, such as former Vice President Budiono and former Finance Minister Sri Mulyani Indrawati, was seen as a reflection of the political complexity surrounding the case. These officials had considerable support and influence, and many questioned whether the legal system was truly capable of holding them accountable. The case was further complicated by political maneuvering within the Indonesian government. Some believed that the investigation into the Bank Century scandal was not as aggressive as it could have been due to the influence of powerful political figures who had a vested interest in protecting their reputations. As a result, the KPK faced significant challenges in its efforts to bring those responsible to justice. Despite this, the case served as an important test of the agency's ability to combat corruption and deliver accountability in a political climate that was often resistant to change. Public outcry continued as activists and human rights organizations demanded that the government take action and provide greater transparency. Protest movements grew in intensity, with citizens taking to the streets to voice their frustration with the political establishment's failure to tackle corruption head-on. Some even called for sweeping reforms to Indonesia's political and judicial systems to ensure that such scandals would not occur again in the future. Despite the resistance faced by the KPK, civil society organizations continued to push for reforms, urging the government to address the underlying issues of corruption and impunity that were at the core of the Bank Century case. Meanwhile, there were calls for the creation of stronger institutions to ensure better oversight and prevent future misuse of public funds. Many people began to see the scandal as a reflection of the broader issues in Indonesia's governance, where corruption and cronyism remained deeply embedded in the system. The case raised important questions about the role of financial institutions in shaping public policy, as well as the ability of Indonesia's regulatory bodies to enforce accountability and oversight effectively. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that solving the Bank Century scandal would require institutional reform to prevent such cases from repeating in the future. In the years that followed, the investigation into the scandal continued, but the ultimate resolution remained elusive. The case lingered in public discourse, serving as a constant reminder of the failures in Indonesia's financial regulatory systems and political institutions. While some individuals faced legal consequences, the full story behind the Bank Century bailout remained untold, and many felt that the truth had not been fully uncovered. The lack of accountability at the highest levels only deepened the sense of disillusionment felt by many Indonesians, who saw the case as emblematic of the larger problem of corruption and political impunity in the country. The Bank Century scandal continued to influence Indonesian politics throughout the following years, as it became a key issue in political campaigns and discussions about governance and accountability. The legacy of the case remained one of unresolved justice, with many individuals continuing to fight for greater transparency and reform. The scandal also had a lasting impact on the public's perception of government institutions, as trust in the political establishment was severely shaken. People across the country became more vocal in their demands for reforms to ensure that future generations would not face the same corruption issues that had plagued Indonesia for decades. Despite the difficulties in resolving the Bank Century case, it served as a catalyst for reform movements in Indonesia. The case highlighted the need for structural changes in the country's financial and political systems to prevent further abuses of power. Calls for stronger checks and balances, as well as reforms to the legal system, gained traction, and political leaders began to recognize the importance of rebuilding public trust in government institutions. However, the road to meaningful reform would be long and difficult, and it was clear that Indonesia still had significant work to do to address the entrenched corruption that had allowed the Bank Century scandal to occur in the first place. As the years went on, the Bank Century case remained an enduring symbol of the challenges facing Indonesia in its struggle to overcome corruption and achieve true democratic governance. The lessons learned from this scandal would continue to influence the country's political landscape, shaping the way Indonesians viewed their government and the importance of holding those in power accountable. It was clear that while progress had been made in addressing corruption, the fight was far from over, and much work remained to be done to ensure that the mistakes of the past would not be repeated in the future. In conclusion, the Bank Century scandal of 2015 exposed deep flaws in Indonesia's financial system, governance, and political structure. It illustrated the risks of political cronyism and the misuse of public funds for personal and political gain. Although some accountability was achieved, the case highlighted the difficulties of tackling corruption in a country where powerful interests often obstruct efforts for reform. The scandal served as a wake-up call for Indonesia, leading to continued calls for greater transparency, stronger institutions, and a more robust system of checks and balances. While justice remained elusive for many involved, the Bank Century case continued to inspire efforts for change and a deeper commitment to fighting corruption in Indonesia. Let's jump to last story. Story 10. In 2015, one of the most significant and widely discussed criminal cases in Indonesia was the case of the murder of Wayan Mirna Salihin. This tragic event, which shocked the nation, involved the death of a young woman who was poisoned at a cafe in Jakarta. The case gained extensive media coverage and became a subject of public debate due to the circumstances surrounding the murder, the investigation, and the trial that followed. Wayan Mirna Salihin, a 27-year-old woman from Bali, had traveled to Jakarta for a trip with her close friends. On January 6, 2015, she met with her two friends, Jessica Kamala Wongso and Herlina Chandra, at a cafe in the popular Grand Indonesia Mall in central Jakarta. The three women had planned to spend time together, and Mirna ordered an iced coffee called Vietnamese iced coffee, which was a popular drink at the cafe. Shortly after drinking the beverage, Mirna suddenly collapsed and appeared to be in severe distress. She was rushed to a nearby hospital, but despite all efforts to save her, she was declared dead within a short time. The doctors at the hospital initially suspected that her death was due to a sudden medical condition, but further examination revealed the presence of cyanide in her system, leading to the conclusion that she had been poisoned. The discovery of cyanide raised alarms and set off an intense investigation into what had happened. It quickly became apparent that Mirna's death was not accidental, but rather a deliberate act of murder. This revelation brought even more attention to the case, as people wondered who could have been behind such a brutal act and what the motivations were. Jessica Kamala Wongso, one of Mirna's close friends, soon emerged as the prime suspect in the case. Initially, she appeared to be distraught over her friend's death and claimed that she had no knowledge of the poison that had been added to the coffee. However, investigators discovered a series of suspicious details that led them to focus on Jessica. During the investigation, it was revealed that Jessica had been in the vicinity of the cafe before Mirna's death, and her actions in the moments leading up to the event became a key focus of the authorities. Jessica's behavior on the day of the incident, as well as some of her past relationships and interactions with Mirna, became important factors in the investigation. Authorities began looking into surveillance footage from the cafe, which showed Jessica being present in the cafe at the time when the drink was ordered and prepared. Further investigation revealed that Jessica had allegedly purchased cyanide in a chemistry store prior to the meeting, although she claimed that it was for a different purpose. She was also seen in the footage handling the drink before it was served to Mirna. The case became even more complex when it was revealed that Jessica had a strained relationship with Mirna. The two had been friends, but there were signs that their friendship had soured in the months leading up to Mirna's death. Some of Mirna's other friends reported that she had mentioned feeling uncomfortable with Jessica's behavior. Despite these tensions, The true nature of their relationship and whether it played a role in the tragic event remained unclear. The police investigation focused on these aspects of Jessica's life, including her emotional state and potential motive. As the investigation continued, the Indonesian public became increasingly fascinated by the case. The media coverage surrounding the incident was extensive, with many people following every detail of the investigation and trial. The case sparked debates about trust, betrayal, and the dark side of friendships. People speculated about Jessica's possible motives for killing Myrna, and some even suggested that there were financial, emotional, or personal reasons behind the murder. Given the unusual and chilling nature of the crime, the public was eager to learn more about the factors that could have led to such a dramatic and tragic outcome. In the months following the murder, Jessica was officially named a suspect in the case. She was arrested and charged with premeditated murder. During the trial, prosecutors argued that Jessica had intentionally poisoned Myrna's coffee with cyanide as part of a carefully planned scheme. They presented evidence from the investigation, including testimonies, surveillance footage, and forensic analysis, which suggested that Jessica had orchestrated the murder. Jessica's defense team, on the other hand, argued that there was insufficient evidence to prove that she had intentionally poisoned Myrna. They claimed that the cyanide found in the coffee could have been the result of an accident or an unforeseen incident. They also pointed out that Jessica had appeared distraught after Myrna's death, and they argued that she may have been wrongly accused due to the pressure from the media and public opinion. However, despite the defense's efforts, the case continued to unfold in a manner that seemed to point toward Jessica's guilt. The investigation also revealed some disturbing elements about Jessica's character and her behavior leading up to the incident. For instance, she had been seen on surveillance footage entering a store to purchase cyanide, a substance that is commonly used as a poison. The authorities also discovered that she had been researching cyanide online before the meeting with Myrna, which further raised suspicions about her involvement in the crime. Some of Jessica's actions during the investigation, including inconsistent statements to the police, were also seen as evidence of her potential guilt. However, her defense team continued to argue that these actions could be explained by stress or panic rather than criminal intent. The case captured the attention of people across Indonesia, with many eagerly awaiting the outcome of the trial. The murder of Wayan Myrna Salihin was not just a criminal case. It became a national scandal, symbolizing a broader set of issues related to trust, betrayal, and relationships in contemporary society. It forced people to question the nature of friendship and how much individuals truly know about the people closest to them. The media coverage created an atmosphere of sensationalism and intrigue, as people became obsessed with the idea of a friend killing another friend in cold blood. Eventually, after months of investigation and a lengthy trial, the court found Jessica Kamala Wongso guilty of premeditated murder. She was sentenced to 20 years in prison, a decision that sparked significant reactions across the country. Some believed that the sentence was too lenient, considering the severity of the crime, while others felt that it was a fair punishment given the evidence presented in court. Jessica's conviction was widely discussed, and many people continued to speculate about her true motives, the role of jealousy, financial issues, and personal grievances in driving her to murder her close friend. The case of Wayan Myrna Salihin's murder in 2015 is still remembered as one of the most shocking and tragic events in Indonesia's recent history. It was a case that exposed the fragility of friendship and how easily trust can be broken, sometimes leading to irreversible consequences. The case also raised important questions about the justice system and the effectiveness of the legal process in dealing with high-profile crimes. The trial of Jessica Kamala Wongso and the aftermath of the murder case continued to dominate public discourse in Indonesia for months following her conviction. The case became a symbol of how complex and multifaceted criminal cases can be, especially when personal relationships are involved. The prosecution's presentation of evidence, including the cyanide purchase, the surveillance footage, and Jessica's behavior, helped paint a compelling narrative of premeditated murder. However, it was Jessica's emotional detachment and unreliable statements during the investigation that seemed to have played a crucial role in the public's perception of her guilt. The sentencing of Jessica was a turning point in the case, but it was not the end of the story. Many Indonesians continued to debate whether the sentence was truly appropriate for the gravity of the crime. The fact that a close friend could commit such a horrifying act of betrayal shook the foundation of how relationships were viewed in the country. Many people questioned the deeper causes behind such an extreme act of violence, and began to reflect on the nature of toxic relationships, manipulation, and trust. The case raised awareness about the darker sides of human behavior, especially in highly emotional and stressful circumstances. Public opinion remained polarized. Some believed that the justice system had done its job by convicting Jessica, while others felt that the investigation had missed important aspects of the case, especially when it came to understanding the psychological state of the perpetrator. Critics argued that psychological assessments of Jessica were not given enough attention during the trial. Was the act of poisoning Myrna truly one of cold-blooded calculation, or was it a result of underlying mental health issues that went undiagnosed? Could the pressures of a strained friendship or unspoken resentments have driven Jessica to such an extreme measure? These questions lingered in the minds of many Indonesians. Additionally, the case brought to light the importance of mental health awareness in Indonesia, especially when dealing with crimes of passion or betrayal. Although Jessica's behavior prior to the murder raised suspicions, there was little focus on whether she had been suffering from psychological trauma or other mental health challenges. This oversight in addressing her emotional state led some to argue that the case also exposed flaws in the way Indonesian society viewed psychological health. In the wake of the case, there were calls for greater attention to mental health services and support for individuals who may be dealing with unresolved emotional pain. Furthermore, the case prompted a broader conversation about friendship dynamics in Indonesian society. The idea of someone close enough to be considered a friend committing such a heinous act left people questioning their own relationships. How well do we really know the people we call our friends? Are we ever fully aware of what others are capable of when it comes to extreme emotions or hidden motives? The tragedy of Myrna's death forced many to reconsider the boundaries of friendship and how fragile those bonds can be under pressure. The case also highlighted how social media and public opinion can influence the course of a criminal trial. From the moment the murder occurred, it was a media sensation. As the investigation unfolded, there was constant coverage of the details surrounding Jessica's life, her relationship with Myrna, and the specifics of the trial. Social media platforms became battlegrounds for armchair detectives who debated every aspect of the case, sometimes leading to the spread of misinformation. This fueled the public's fascination and, at times, a biased view of the individuals involved. In the years following the conviction, some media outlets continued to provide updates on Jessica's life in prison, and the case remained a topic of discussion in Indonesian pop culture. Documentaries, articles, and television programs about the murder and its trial kept Myrna's death alive in the public's mind, and new theories and analyses of the case continued to surface. This ensured that the case remained entrenched in the collective memory of Indonesians, sparking ongoing debates about justice, punishment, and the social dynamics of trust and betrayal. The impact of the Myrna Salihin murder case extended beyond the immediate legal proceedings. It raised questions about the role of friendship and how society views individuals who commit crimes of passion or betrayal. As the years went by, the case remained one of Indonesia's most notorious criminal incidents, serving as a cautionary tale about the consequences of unchecked emotions, the dangers of toxic relationships, and the unpredictable nature of human behavior. The investigation into the murder revealed flaws in the handling of sensitive psychological matters, while the trial showed that the law, though capable of convicting someone for premeditated murder, cannot always fully address the complexities of the human psyche. The case forced a re-examination of how social pressures, emotional distress, and mental health issues could contribute to violent behavior. It underscored the necessity for more comprehensive approaches to mental health care and relationship counseling in Indonesia, particularly in preventing such tragic outcomes. For Myrna's family and friends, the case was a permanent reminder of the fragility of life and the profound impact of a betrayal by someone close to them. It took a young woman's life and left her family with a sense of incomprehensible loss. In the end, the Wayan Myrna Salihin case was not just a criminal case about poison and betrayal. It was a reflection of the darker sides of human relationships, the psychological complexities behind violent actions, and the long-lasting effects of emotional trauma. The legacy of the case continues to echo through Indonesian society, as it remains a point of reference for discussions about the nature of crime, the psychology of murderers, and the importance of mental health awareness. It is a somber reminder that the pursuit of justice must also include a deeper understanding of the factors that drive individuals to commit such heinous acts, and that true justice must consider not only the punishment, but also the roots of such behavior in society.